Some places on the map are left blank on purpose. Out in the high desert of California, there is a stretch of sand the Army runs trucks across every single day. And there is a list of rules for driving it that nobody will let you read until the day you were hired. I thought those rules were a joke, they tell the new man. By the end of my first month, I had clawed my way out of my own grave to learn they were the only thing keeping me alive. Stay with me to the end of this one, because the part that still wakes me at night is not the dead men in the desert. It is what was waiting at the bottom. Before we drive out into the desert together, I want to know who is riding along tonight. So do me a favor and drop your town and your country down in the comments, because it always amazes me how far these stories travel. Whether you are listening from a quiet bedroom, a long night shift, or a car parked somewhere you probably should not be. Settle in, keep the lights low, and let us begin. There is a shallow grave out in the Mojave with the marks of my own fingers dug into the inside of it, clawing upward. And the strangest part is that I am the one who climbed out. I have told this to almost no one, because the people who would believe me are already dead or already gone, and the people who would not believe me have comfortable lives I do not wish to ruin. But I am going to tell it now, the whole thing, exactly the way it happened. And I am going to start at the beginning, before I knew that the desert keeps a ledger, and that every name written in it is owed. I am a civilian mechanic. For most of my working life, I have been a contractor for the United States Army, which is a polite way of saying that I do the jobs the uniformed men do not want to do. We save the government a great deal of money. They hand us the ugly assignments, the long ones, the lonely ones. Driving for hours into the middle of nothing. Repairing armored vehicles worth more than my house, more than my whole street, that some 20-year-old private has managed to bury in mud or cook to death in a remote training range. For years the work was a routine I could have done in my sleep. I would find the fault, I would fix it, I would fill out the paperwork, and I would go home to a cold dinner and a warm bed. That was the shape of my life, and I was grateful for how boring it was. Everything changed when they transferred me to a certain installation in the high desert of California. You have heard of it, even if you do not know that you have. It is the kind of place that shows up in the stories people tell at night to frighten each other, and the kind of place the government swears is only a flat stretch of sand and a few hangars. I will not give you its real name. It will not help you, and it might hurt me. From the very first day, I felt a strange coldness in the way the other men in the shop treated me. They looked at me with something that was half pity and half a thing I could not name. The shop itself was a long steel building that held the heat like an oven, and let it out grudgingly all night, and the men in it moved with a slowness that I first took for laziness and only later understood as caution. They did not slam doors, they did not whistle while they worked. They started making jokes about the ghosts of the desert, about the things that walk the ranges after sundown, and I assumed they were doing what every crew does to the new man. You needle him, you see if he flinches. I did not flinch, because I did not believe a word of it. I had spent 23 years under trucks in places far worse than this, and I had seen plenty of men die of stupidity and machinery and bad luck, and not one of them had ever come back to bother me about it. Then, after the shift ended on my third evening, one of them pulled me aside, and the whole tone of his voice changed. His name was Eddie. He was a heavy, slow-moving man with a burn scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow, and he had a habit of cracking his knuckles one finger at a time when he was about to say something he did not want to say. He said, "Listen to me, and listen closely, the mechanic you replaced." He did not quit. He disappeared. He took a distress call over the radio one night, from a unit out on the ranges, and no one else on the base ever heard that call. Not the tower, not dispatch, only him. He drove out into the night to help them, because he was a good man, and being a good man out here is the most dangerous thing you can be. He never came back. 3 days later, we found his truck. It was buried up to the roof in the side of a sand hill, packed in so tight and so deep that it was not possible. Not by any machine we own, and we never found one piece of him. Eddie's voice dropped lower then, and he stopped cracking his knuckles and went very still. He was my friend, he said. I drove him to the airport when he first came out here, and I dug at that sandhill with my own hands for 2 days until they made me stop. There are rules out here, he said. Nobody writes them down. If you do not learn them and keep them, the desert will swallow you whole, the same way it swallowed him. And I am telling you because I cannot watch it happen twice. I laughed about it later, alone in my room. I decided it was an elaborate trick, a piece of theater they performed for every newcomer. And I felt clever for seeing through it. I thought I was the smart one. I was a fool, and I did not know yet how completely the desert was going to teach me that I was a fool. A few days after that, I was driving my service truck alone, deep into the training ranges, on a call to recover a generator. The light was doing that thing it does out there in the late afternoon, when the heat lifts off the ground in sheets and the whole horizon begins to swim. That is when I saw something off the unpaved road. A glint of metal where there should have been only creosote and stone. I turned the wheel and bounced across the hardpan toward it. And I slowed, and I stopped, and I felt my whole body go wrong before my mind had even caught up. It was a military cargo truck, the big six-wheeled kind the troops call a deuce and a half. And it was old. A model from somewhere around 1968, the olive paint gone chalky and the canvas over the bed rotted down to bare threads. It was sunk to the axles in the side of a dune, nose down, half swallowed. I climbed down from my cab to see if anyone needed help, because that is what you do, and the moment my boots hit the sand, my heart fell all the way down into my feet and my hands began to shake without my permission. There were two of them. One sat slumped behind the wheel of the cargo truck in a uniform rotted and split along every seam. The fabric gone the gray of old ash, the other lay on the sand by the front wheel. Face down, one arm thrown out as if it had reached for something and run out of time. The smell reached me a second later, and it was not the smell of death I knew from accidents on the highway. It was older than that, and drier, like a closed room that has not been opened in 50 years, like dust and copper and something sweet underneath that made my stomach turn over. There was no sound at all, no wind, no insects, not even the small ticking the desert makes as it cools. The silence had a weight to it, a pressure, as if the air had been replaced with something thicker. And I became aware of my own breathing the way you do when you are the only living thing for miles and you are no longer certain that is true. I stood there trying to make the picture make sense, and the picture would not let me. Then the picture moved. The one behind the wheel turned its head toward me. Slowly, so slowly, with a small dry sound, and its eyes were open, and there was nothing behind them at all. Just a flat, dead emptiness that looked at me and did not see me and saw me anyway. And the one on the ground began to dig. It pushed its bone-thin hands into the sand and started scooping it away from the buried front wheel, the way you would dig out a stuck truck, patient and tireless, as if it had been doing this for a very long time and meant to do it forever. I have never moved the way I moved then. I ran for my truck like a man on fire. I threw myself into the cab. I slammed the door, I jammed the pedal to the floor, and I drove for the base with both hands locked on the wheel. The world began to bend around me as I drove, the ground tilting in ways that ground does not tilt, the horizon folding closer and then farther, the sound of my own engine stretching long and low like a voice slowed down. And then there was nothing. I am going to stop us here for just one breath, right at the worst possible moment, and I am sorry for that. If the back of your neck has started to prickle, that is the story doing its job, so go ahead and tap that subscribe button now while you are still thinking about it. There is a lot more desert ahead of us, and you do not want to be left behind out here. All right? Back to it. I woke up in the small infirmary on the base with a saline line taped into my arm and the taste of dust thick in my mouth. Eddie was there, and standing over me was my shop supervisor, an old man named Walt. Walt was past 70 and still working. Lean and brown as a strip of jerky, with pale eyes that always seemed to be measuring something just behind you. He had buried 2 wives and outlived 3 trucks, and the men respected him in the careful way you respect a thing that has survived what should have killed it. He spoke first, and his voice was hard. "You broke the rules," he said. "You are lucky you are still breathing. Your truck is gone. We found it, and the metal of it had gone into the sand. The particles of the body fused right down into the grains as if some force had pressed them together at the level where there is no longer any difference between a truck and a desert. And the worst thing," he said, "the thing that should not be possible, is that you covered a distance that takes 2 hours to drive in under 2 minutes from your last radio check. You went somewhere, son. You stepped sideways out of time and you came back, and most men do not." Then Eddie sat me up against the pillow and handed me a folded piece of paper. soft and gray with handling. And he said, "Here, these are the rules. The ones you thought were a joke. I read them. I have read them so many times since that I could recite them in my sleep. Except that I do not let myself sleep deeply anymore. There were three that mattered most. The first was the rule of the standing man. If you are driving at night and your high beams fall on a person standing still in the road ahead, do not let the light stay on him. Take your foot off the gas, dim your lamps, and roll to a slow stop well short of where he waits. A living soldier will walk toward you and wave his arms. A dead one only stands and waits for you to come the rest of the way to him." The second was the rule of your own name. The base will only ever call you over the radio by your last name and your truck number. It will never use your first name. Not once, not for any reason. So if a voice comes across the radio and calls you by your first name, soft and familiar, do not key the microphone, do not answer it, and do not believe a single word it says. Reach over and shut the set off. The third was the rule of the even trade. Never take one thing from the desert, not water, not a tool, not a ride, and never give it one thing either, unless you are making a trade you are dead certain comes out even on both sides. Out here, helping a man for free is the most expensive thing you can ever do. The weeks went by, and I followed those rules the way a drowning man follows a rope. I kept the radio low, and my eyes on the road, and my high beams off whatever waited at the edges of it. And the desert showed me many things, at the edges of my sight, where the heat shimmer thickened into shapes that walked when I was not looking and stood still when I was. A figure in a doorway of a building that had no door, a line of footprints that started in the middle of open sand and ended just as suddenly, with no one at either end. Once parked at the far side of a range road, a service truck exactly like mine, with a man in the cab who lifted his hand to me, and I did not lift mine back. And when I looked again, the truck was gone, and there had never been a road there at all. I taught myself not to turn toward any of it. Eddie told me that was the whole trick of staying alive out here. You do not look, you do not answer. You give the desert nothing to hold on to, and most days it lets you go home. And here is a strange thing I have noticed. The people who get the most spooked are almost always the ones who have not pressed that little like button yet. I am only saying, if you are gripping your phone a little tighter than you were a minute ago, that might be the desert telling you to fix that before we go any deeper. And then came the night that all of it had been building to. Though I did not understand that yet, we were at the height of an enormous training exercise. The whole base was running on no sleep and bad coffee. I had not closed my eyes in 2 days, and the world had taken on that grainy, scraped quality that comes when the body is past its limit. A little before midnight, a call came in. An armored vehicle, a striker, had broken down in a stretch of broken country far out in the hills, a place the old hands called the Anvil, though no one would tell me why. Walt did not want to send anyone. I saw it in his face, but the call was official, and the soldiers were real. And so the three of us went, Walt and Eddie and me, out into the worst of it. The air was thick enough to chew, and the radio in the truck was throwing out a static that did not sound like static. There was a rhythm in it, a breathing, slow and wet, and now and then something that was almost a word, almost my own name. Walt reached over without a word and turned the volume all the way down, and we drove the rest of the way in a quiet that was somehow louder than the noise had been. When we reached the striker, it was sitting dead and lightless with no engine, nothing, like a thing that had simply stopped being alive. 20 tons of armor turned into a tomb. The soldiers inside were in a state I will never forget, hysterical, screaming, pounding on the inside of the hull with their fists, with their helmets, with anything they could reach, and yet the sound of it was strangely muffled, as if it were coming from much farther away than the few feet that separated us. They were out of their minds with a terror that had no shape I could see. The problem was not mechanical. I knew it the second I laid my palm flat against the hull, the way you know a sick animal by the heat of it, except the steel was not hot, it was cold. It was colder than the night, colder than steel has any right to be in the desert, and the cold of it crawled up my arm and into my chest and sat there. The cause had a name, though I did not learn the name until later, and I am sorry that I did. The men called it Cora. Cora was not a creature you could shoot. Cora was the desert itself when it was hungry, a thing that fed on fear and panic and the bad choices of frightened commanders. And it had reached into that striker and convinced those soldiers that they were surrounded, that the enemy was on every side, that there was no way out. It had taken their radios and turned their own voices against them. Then the radio came alive. The static peeled back all at once, and through it came a voice, calm and clear and warm. And it called me by my first name. It said it twice, gentle and close, the way someone who loved me a long time ago used to say it when I had wandered too far from home. And every rule I had learned went quiet in me, and all I wanted in the whole world was to key that microphone and answer, to tell those boys in the striker to hold on, that help had come for them. I am a man who fixes things. I am a man who answers when he is called. My hand was already closing around the microphone, and my thumb was already on the key. I did not press it. Walt's hand came across the cab with a violence I would not have believed an old man could carry. He tore the microphone out of my grip, and when I lunged for it again, he caught the back of my head and drove it into the dashboard hard enough that I tasted blood and saw white. I screamed at him. "Why did you do that?" He looked at me, and his pale eyes were full of fear and a terrible steadiness at the same time, and he said in a low, cracked whisper, "We have to let it happen to them. These are the rules. If you interfere now, Cora takes all three of us. The next step is the wager. And we are going to win the wager tonight. Do you understand me? Do you understand?" The radio went silent. Not quiet. Silent, in a way that pressed on my ears. The way deep water presses. And in that silence I understood that the soldiers in the striker were gone. That whatever made them themselves had been emptied out. And that there was nothing left in that vehicle now but meat and a lesson. We did not turn back. Walt drove the truck off the last of the road and out into country where there were no roads at all, only the pale floor of the desert running onto a horizon that seemed to fall farther away with every mile we put behind us. And I understood that we were long past the place where any of the rules could still save us. Then figures rose up in the reach of the headlights ahead of us, standing dead still in our path, and Walt dimmed the lamps and brought the truck to a slow stop well short of them. Exactly the way the first rule said to do. There were 6 of them. They wore army uniforms, correct in every detail, and they walked toward us with an easy, unhurried stride. When the headlights found their faces, the blood went still in me. They had no faces. Where the features should have been, there was only smooth, unbroken skin, hold tight, blank as the inside of an egg. No eyes, no mouths. And yet I knew, the way you know in a dream, that they were looking at us, and that one of them was about to speak, though it had nothing to speak with. One of them came to the window. It made a small, friendly, conversational sound, the kind of opening a man makes when he wants to chat. Walt's hand found my knee and pressed down hard, a warning to keep still and keep quiet. The thing leaned close to the glass, and in a voice that came from no mouth it asked whether we had seen the relief convoy come through. Because it and its men had been waiting out here a long while, and they were getting thirsty. Walt did not even pause, and he did not lower his window past the crack it was already open. He spoke to them the way a tired foreman speaks to a crew standing around on his time. "The convoy rolled through better than an hour ago," he said, easy and bored. "You boys missed it. Water and all. Turn around and get back to your line before somebody marks you absent." He said it as if their faces were the most ordinary faces in the world, as if there were nothing there to see at all, and he gave them nothing, not a drop of water, not one word of pity, not the smallest flicker of the fear that was crawling all over me. The faceless thing was quiet for a moment. The desert held that moment open far too long, and I could hear Eddie breathing through his teeth beside me, and I could feel Walt's hand resting loose and ready near the gear shift. Then it said, in a flat and unbothered voice, "We must have missed it." And it stepped back from the window, and the other 5 stepped back with it, all together, and stood aside to let us pass. That was the wager, and Walt had won it. I learned later, in pieces, how it works. The things out there are starving, always, and they live on 2 foods only, on fear and on being seen for what they are. If you flinch, if your eyes drop even once to the smooth place where a face should be, if you let on for a single instant that you know they are not men, then you have handed them something, and the moment you have handed them something they are owed all the rest of you. And if you offer them a kindness, water, a ride, a hand, You have opened a trade that can never come out even, because they only take and they give nothing back. The single way through is to give them nothing at all, no fear, no water, no name for what they are. Walt looked 6 dead things in their blank faces and treated them like latecomers to a work detail. And because he gave them nothing, they had nothing to hold, and they let us by. And ahead of us, where the headlights should have shown more open sand, the ground itself fell away into a vast open pit, wider than my eyes could hold, sunk into the desert floor where no map had ever marked a thing. A road of packed sand spiraled down the inside of it, and far below, at the bottom, something turned, slow and heavy and patient. The men who knew of it called it the mill. We drove down into the pit, and the deeper we went, the less the world behaved. The spiral road seemed to stretch longer beneath the wheels the farther we descended, so that we drove for what felt like an hour, and the rim of light above us never grew any smaller. The walls of packed sand breathed, swelling out and drawing back in a slow rhythm I felt inside my own lungs, until I could not tell whether the pit was breathing or I was. The light was the worst of it, a dull red glow that seemed to seep up out of the sand itself and threw no clean shadow, so that my own shape on the ground seemed to belong to someone else. The faceless men lined the road the whole way down, standing shoulder to shoulder, hundreds of them, then thousands, perfectly still. As we passed, their blank heads turned to follow us, all together, with that small dry sound I had heard once before beside a buried truck, and I kept my eyes down on my own hands in my lap, because by then I had learned what looking costs, and at the bottom there was the mill, vast and slow and grinding, a great iron wheel of a thing turning on nothing at all, and I understood that this was the source, that all the wrongness of the desert was ground out of this one turning thing the way flour is ground out of grain. And there, standing before the mill itself, untouched by it, was a woman, and Walt made a sound I had never heard a man make. Her name was June. She had been a mechanic on this base, years before me, and she was on the list of the ones who vanished. But she had not died. She had walked down into this place and survived it, and she had made something the others could only whisper about. A new covenant. She had come here for her father, to buy him back from what he owed. And I watched Walt's face come apart. And that was how I learned that the father was Walt, and that years ago, as part of the old debts of this place, Walt had given up his own small son to the desert, and had carried that weight every single day since. June spoke, and her voice came from every surface at once. "This is a new covenant," she said. "The old ways are dead. We do not pay in children anymore. We pay in mercy. We find redemption, or we find nothing." I could not take in the rest of it. Eddie grabbed my arm and pulled, and we ran straight at the mill itself, because he swore the only way out of that place was through the very thing that ran it. The turning wheel took us. I felt myself come apart the way June had said, ground down, every part of me pulled away from every other part and scattered wide, while a great nothing opened underneath and swallowed me down. There is no human word for that pain. I have tried for years to find one. I woke spitting dirt. Eddie and I were clawing our way up out of a shallow grave in the open desert, both of us digging upward toward a sky that was going pale with dawn. The pit was gone. The mill was gone. The faceless men were gone. There was only sand and silence and the cold that comes right before sunrise. I looked down at my own body. Every hurt I had carried, the split on my forehead, the cuts on my hands, the bruise where Walt had put my head into the dash, all of it was gone. The mill had taken us apart and put us back together clean. We started walking south, toward where the base should be, and it was a long, hard walk in the rising heat. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There did not seem to be anything left to say that the morning did not already know. After about an hour, the sun was full up and the sweat had dried white on our shirts, and that was when we saw something I knew. The same old cargo truck, the Deuce and a Half from 1968, sunk nose down in a dune. The same 2 dead soldiers, still digging at the sand with their patient, ruined hands, trying to free a truck that had been stuck for more than 50 years and would be stuck for 50 more. The first time I had run. This time I looked at Eddie, and I thought about the new covenant, and I thought about the oldest rule the Army has, the one that does not get written on any gray piece of paper. You do not leave anyone behind. I walked toward the truck with steady steps. The soldier behind the wheel turned to me. His face was half gone, his tongue swollen black, his eyes sunk deep, and he looked at me. And I said in a voice I made strong on purpose, "Do you boys need a hand?" The thing answered in a dry and grateful rasp. "Yes," it said. "We would surely appreciate that." Eddie and I spent the next hours with those dead men, digging the sand away from the wheels and working the seized engine with the few tools we carried. And when it finally turned over and caught with a cough of black smoke, we climbed up into the cab beside them. They drove us across the silent flats until we reached the edge of the paved road that runs to the base. Eddie and I climbed down, and I turned to the soldier at the wheel and asked, "Is there anything else we can do to free you from this circle?" The thing lifted its ruined hand in a slow salute and said, "No. You have already freed us. With mercy. With redemption." Then it put the truck in gear and drove it toward the road, and in front of our eyes the truck and the two soldiers began to fade, thinning into the morning air until there was nothing where they had been, as if they had not waited there for more than 50 years. We came back to the shop on the base, and everything was calm in a way that was worse than any alarm. Walt's chair sat empty, pushed back from his desk as if he had just that moment stood up from it. The coffee he had brewed before that terrible night was still warm in the pot. But Walt and June did not come back. They had gone on with the new covenant, wherever it leads. A father and the daughter who had walked down into that place to buy him back from what he owed. Eddie did not say a word. He walked across the shop to the duty roster that hangs on the wall by the door. The list of every man on the crew, and he stood in front of it for a long time. And then he made a sound I will not try to put into words. I came up beside him, and I looked. There, in fresh ink, near the top of the list, was a name that had been struck off that board months before I ever set foot on this base. The mechanic who vanished. The one I had replaced. Eddie's friend, the man whose truck they had found buried to the roof in a sandhill. The man they never found one piece of. His name was back on the roster, marked present for duty, written in a hand that none of us had written. I looked past it to the row of lockers along the back wall. One of them had stood emptied out and open and bare for the better part of a year. It was full again now. A work jacket hung on the hook. A photograph of a woman and two small children was taped inside the door, and a coffee mug sat on the bench below it, half full, the surface of it trembling just slightly, the way a cup trembles when a man has set it down a moment ago and walked off to find a wrench. Eddie put his hand flat against the cold metal of that locker, and his shoulders shook. And I understood then what we had done out there. The facing of the fear, the helping of the lost, the giving of a hand without asking for an even trade in return. It had reached back through everything and rewritten what was. Somewhere a man who had been swallowed whole by the desert had been quietly handed back his life. His wife had not become a widow. His children had not grown up with an empty chair at the table. The debt had been paid, and it had been paid in mercy, and the desert, for once in all its long hunger, had given something back. If you made it all the way out here with me, then you already know the rule that matters most. You do not leave anyone behind. So before you go, leave a comment and tell me one thing. Would you have grabbed that microphone, or would you have let it ring? I read every single one of them. If this story kept you up, press the like button, subscribe so the next one finds its way to you, and share it with the one friend who never believes you. I will have another for you very soon. Until then, watch your mirrors and watch the road. My name is Paul. I've lived in Regina, Saskatchewan all my life, surrounded by endless prairies that stretch toward the horizon like a sea of wheat and grass. The flat landscape can feel isolating, especially in winter when everything freezes over and darkness comes early. I turned 19 last month, in April 2022. At 68 inches and 260 pounds, I've always been the biggest guy in any room. People often assume nothing frightens me because of my size. Most of the time, they're right. Regina might seem unassuming to outsiders, just another Canadian prairie city with modest buildings and wide streets. But like any place with history, it has its secrets. Growing up here, I heard whispers of strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena that people discussed in hushed tones. The indigenous communities in particular maintained rich oral traditions about entities that walked the boundary between our world and something else. As a child, I was fascinated by paranormal accounts. I devoured books about unexplained phenomena, watched documentaries late into the night, and questioned anyone willing to share stories. My parents found my interest amusing, but harmless. Imagination is healthy for a growing boy, my mother would say, though her expression sometimes betrayed concern when I'd excitedly recount the latest terrifying tale I'd discovered. Despite this lifelong fascination, I never experienced anything truly inexplicable myself, not until I was 16. The event that occurred that summer night changed how I perceive reality. It remains burned into my memory, resurging in nightmares and quiet moments when my guard is down. Winter in Saskatchewan is brutal, but summer brings its own intensity. Long days that stretch past 10 p.m., humid heat that builds toward afternoon thunderstorms, and nights alive with insects. The prairies transform from barren expanses to lush fields teeming with life. The tall grass waves in the breeze like water, concealing whatever might move beneath. What happened to me occurred during one of these summer nights, when the air hung heavy with moisture and distant heat. Lightning occasionally illuminated the horizon. But to understand why I was where I was, and why what I saw affected me so deeply, I need to explain how deeply embedded the local legends had become in my thinking. My freshman year of high school introduced me to Michael, whose family had moved to Regina from Manitoba. Unlike many teenagers who dismissed local folklore as superstition, Michael approached these stories with respectful curiosity. His father worked in cultural preservation at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, giving Michael access to accounts and artifacts most people never encountered. "You can't just dismiss things because they don't fit your worldview," Michael told me once as we walked home from school. Indigenous communities have maintained oral histories for generations. Their knowledge of the land and what lives on it goes deeper than most people understand. We spent countless afternoons in his basement, poring over books and discussing theories about the unexplained. It was Michael who first mentioned the Rougarou to me, not in the context of Louisiana where most associate the legend, but as interpreted by local indigenous communities. "The concept exists across cultures," he explained, "a being that shifts between human and animal form, often as punishment for transgression. The French brought the loup-garou concept, but indigenous communities had their own traditions of shapeshifters long before European contact." I remember leaning forward, captivated. "But what exactly is it supposed to be?" Michael's expression grew serious. "Not what most movies portray. It's not just a man who becomes a wolf under the full moon. It's something that exists in between states, neither fully human nor fully animal. Some accounts describe it as having a human body with a canine head, others as walking upright but moving like an animal." "Have there been sightings around here?" I asked. Michael nodded slowly. "More than you'd think, especially on the outskirts of the city, where development pushes into former wilderness. My dad says reports spike during construction projects that disturb previously untouched land." What fascinated me wasn't just the creature itself, but what it represented. The uncomfortable space between known and unknown, between civilization and wilderness. I didn't know then how personally I would come to understand that liminal terror. The summer before my fateful encounter, I began spending time with Jasmine, whose family lived on a reservation about 40 minutes outside Regina. We met through a community basketball program where my height made me valuable despite my mediocre coordination. Jasmine possessed a quiet confidence I admired. When conversation among teens turned to local legends, most would laugh or embellish for dramatic effect. Jasmine never did either. She listened, occasionally corrected details, but mostly remained silent during these discussions. One evening after practice, several of us gathered at a local diner. Someone mentioned recent reports of strange howls heard near the city's edge. "Probably just coyotes," Jeremy suggested, reaching for his soda. "They sound weirder than people expect." "Or someone's dog got loose," Ben added with a shrug. I noticed Jasmine's expression change slightly, a subtle tightening around her eyes. Later, as we walked to the bus stop, I asked her about it. "You look concerned back there. Do you know something about those howls?" She walked several steps before responding. "My grandmother would say that some sounds aren't meant to be heard by human ears. When you hear them, it means boundaries are weakening." "What kind of boundaries?" "Between here and elsewhere." She stopped walking and turned to face me. "Paul, my mother's cousin saw something last month. She was walking home at dusk, took a shortcut near the western edge of the reservation. There's a stretch of tall grass there that separates the homes from the road. I waited as Jasmine seemed to consider whether to continue. She said she felt watched first. That's always the first sign, the feeling of eyes following you, then movement in the grass, but not like wind, more purposeful. She started walking faster, and that's when she heard it breathing. An animal? I asked. She thought so at first. Maybe a coyote or stray dog, but the breathing was wrong, too deep, too controlled. When she looked back, she saw something rising from the grass, standing up on two legs, but not like a person would stand. A chill spread across my shoulders despite the warm evening. What did she do? Ran. Never looked back again. Got home and couldn't speak for an hour, just trembled. Jasmine adjusted her backpack. My grandmother performed a cleansing ceremony for her. Said the creature didn't follow her home, but it had noticed her. And once these things notice you, they remember. I tried to keep my tone light. Do you believe it was real? What she saw? Jasmine's expression remained serious. I believe she saw something that terrified her. Whether it was what the elders call Rougarou or something else, I don't know. But Paul, she touched my arm lightly. Be careful in open spaces at night, especially where the prairie grass grows tall. Some things hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice them. And once you see them, they see you back. Her warning stayed with me, though I didn't heed it as carefully as I should have. Teenagers often feel a sense of invulnerability, especially teenagers my size. The day leading up to my encounter began ordinarily enough. It was late August 2019, with that peculiar quality of late summer light that seems to stretch impossibly as the season wanes. School would resume in 2 weeks, and I was determined to make the most of remaining freedom. I spent the morning helping my father repair our back deck, the wood having warped during the previous winter's harsh freezes. Manual labor came easily to me given my size, though I lacked the precision my father had developed through years of carpentry work. Hand me that level, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. As I passed it to him, he paused. Any plans for tonight? Going to Jeremy's. Probably play some games, hang out. He nodded approvingly. Jeremy lived in a good neighborhood, and his parents were the attentive type who actually checked in on what we were doing. Just be home at a reasonable hour. Your mother worries. I agreed without argument. At 16, I'd learned that maintaining my parents' trust afforded me more freedom than pushing boundaries. After finishing with the deck, I showered and texted Jeremy to confirm our plans. Several other friends would be there, Ben, Michael, and a couple guys from the basketball team. We'd planned a marathon gaming session with breaks for pizza and whatever snacks Jeremy's mom would inevitably provide, despite our protests that we could handle our own food. The afternoon passed quickly as I helped my mother with groceries and finished summer reading assignments I'd procrastinated on. Around 6, I grabbed my backpack with a change of clothes, my wireless controller, and a few energy drinks I'd smuggled past my mother's watchful eye. I'm heading out, I called, already halfway through the door. Be careful, my mother responded, her typical farewell. Call if you need anything. I threw my bag over my shoulder and grabbed my bike from the garage. My car was in the shop. Nothing serious, just routine maintenance, so I'd be relying on pedal power. Regina's flat landscape made biking easy, though the distance to Jeremy's house was considerable. I'd done it many times before and thought nothing of the journey home, even knowing it would likely be after midnight when I left. I arrived at Jeremy's house as evening approached. His mother answered the door with her usual warm smile. Paul, the boys are already downstairs. I've ordered pizza. It should be here in 30 minutes. The basement had been converted into the ultimate teenage hangout. Large TV, gaming consoles, comfortable seating, and a mini fridge Jeremy's parents kept stocked with non-alcoholic options. Michael and Ben were already settled in, controllers in hand, arguing good-naturedly about tournament brackets. Finally, Ben called as I descended the stairs. We need a fourth to make this fair. The hours melted away as they often do in good company. We played, ate, talked about girls from school, debated upcoming game releases, and generally existed in that perfect bubble of teenage male camaraderie. No serious concerns, no real-world pressures, just friendship and competition. Around 1 a.m, Jeremy's father came downstairs to remind us of the time. The others were sleeping over, but I hadn't planned to stay. You sure you don't want to crash here? Jeremy asked as I gathered my things. The couch is free. I considered it briefly, but decided against it. Nah, I promised my mom I'd be home. Besides, I've biked back later than this before. Michael frowned slightly.
It's pretty dark out there. I've got lights. I patted my backpack where my bike lights were stored. And unlike you weaklings, I don't fear the night. I flexed dramatically, earning the expected round of groans and insults. If I had listened to that slight hesitation in Michael's voice, perhaps what followed would never have happened. But confidence, some might call it arrogance, is the particular domain of teenage boys who haven't yet learned their limitations. I said my goodbyes and headed upstairs, Jeremy following to lock the door behind me. "Text when you get home," he said, our usual practice when any of us traveled alone at night. "Will do." I secured my backpack, attached my lights to my bike, and pushed off into the darkness, completely unaware that in less than 30 minutes, my understanding of the world would fundamentally change. The night air had cooled considerably, a welcome relief after the day's humidity. Regina's streets were largely deserted, with only occasional cars passing, mostly taxis and late-night workers heading home. The city takes on a different character after midnight. Familiar landmarks cast unusual shadows, and sounds carry differently through the quiet. My route home from Jeremy's house normally took about 30 minutes at a casual pace. I could cut it to 20 if I pushed myself, which I often did during daylight hours. At night, I typically followed the most well-lit streets, even though this added distance. But that night, feeling restless and energetic from the hours of competition, I decided to take the shorter route that would lead me past Wascana Park and down a long, straight road that ran alongside a large open field. The main streets posed no issues. Streetlights illuminated my path, and the rhythm of pedaling lulled me into that meditative state cyclists often experience, mind-wandering while body works automatically. I thought about school starting soon, about college applications I would need to prepare in the coming year, about the girl in my chemistry class I hoped would be assigned as my lab partner again. As I turned onto the less populated street that would take me past the park, the darkness intensified. Here, streetlights were spaced farther apart, creating pools of illumination with stretches of shadow between them. To my left stretched Wascana Park, normally a beautiful green space in daylight, now transformed into an impenetrable wall of blackness. To my right stood houses, most with lights off at this hour, their occupants long since retired for the night. I'd traveled this route many times before without incident, but something felt different. The sensation came gradually, an awareness that pricked at the edges of my consciousness, like the moment before thunder when the air seems to hold its breath. I found myself glancing repeatedly toward the park, squinting to penetrate the darkness. Nothing moved there, at least nothing I could see. Yet the feeling of being observed intensified with each passing minute. I increased my speed, shifting my bike to a higher gear. The cool air now felt uncomfortably cold against my face as I picked up pace. "Just your imagination," I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice strangely muffled in the night air. "Michael's story's getting to you." But the sensation persisted, that crawling awareness of being tracked, studied. Prey animals must feel this way when predators fixate on them from concealment, I thought. The idea did nothing to comfort me. My eyes strained to monitor my surroundings while still watching the road ahead. The path ran straight for nearly a mile, making it impossible to quickly reach the safety of more populated areas. The rational part of my brain insisted nothing was wrong, that I was allowing stories and darkness to affect my perception. But more primitive instincts, the ancient human fear of being hunted, overrode logic. I pedaled harder, pushing my muscles to increase speed. Wind rushed past my ears, partially drowning out other sounds, which somehow made me more uneasy rather than less. I couldn't hear if something was approaching over the sound of my own movement. That's when I noticed a movement in my peripheral vision, something keeping pace with me in the park to my left. The darkness made details impossible to discern, but something large was definitely moving parallel to my route, just beyond the reach of the intermittent streetlights. My heart rate, already elevated from exertion, now pounded painfully against my ribs. Fight or flight response flooded my system with adrenaline, pushing me to greater speed. I threw the gears into their highest setting and pumped my legs with desperate energy. Whatever moved in the darkness matched my increased pace effortlessly. It stayed carefully within the shadows, never venturing into the spill of light from the street lamps. This deliberate avoidance of illumination struck me as terrifyingly intentional. Not the behavior of an animal operating on instinct, but something with calculation and purpose. The distance to the end of the street seemed to stretch impossibly. Each revolution of my pedals felt like it covered less ground than it should, as though the road itself was extending before me. sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air, and my breathing became ragged. What terrified me most wasn't the presence of something tracking me. It was the growing certainty that it was waiting for something. Playing with me. It could have overtaken me already if speed was its only objective. The realization sent waves of fresh fear through my body. The intersection that marked the end of this nightmarish stretch finally came into view. A junction where the road met a pedestrian underpass that tunneled beneath railway tracks. Once through that underpass, I'd be back in a well-populated area, just minutes from home. Safety seemed tangibly close. As I approached the intersection, the movement in the park stopped. Through my terror, curiosity compelled me to glance left one final time. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. Standing at the edge of the park, precisely at the boundary where darkness met the weak illumination of the distant streetlight, was a figure. At first glance, its silhouette suggested a large dog or perhaps a wolf, though neither should exist in urban Regina. But as I slowed slightly, my body betraying my mind's command to keep moving, the figure rose. It stood on its hind legs in a motion no natural animal could accomplish. The transformation from quadruped to biped happened with disturbing fluidity, like watching oil pour upward against gravity. What had seemed dog-like in profile now towered at a height that matched or exceeded my own considerable stature. The creature's proportions were wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Its torso approximated a human form, but with shoulders too broad and a waist too narrow. The arms hung unnaturally long, extending well past where knees would be on a human. Each hand, if such appendages could be called hands, terminated in elongated digits tipped with what appeared to be claws that captured and reflected the distant streetlight. Most disturbing was its head, unmistakably canine in structure but larger than any wolf or dog I had ever seen. The snout protruded with unnatural length, and even at this distance, I could make out teeth visible beyond closed jaws. But it was the eyes that truly horrified me. They caught the meager light and reflected it back as twin points of amber luminescence. Unlike animal eyes that simply reflect light mechanically, these possessed awareness, intelligence that observed and calculated. They fixed on me with predatory focus and something worse, recognition. We regarded each other across the distance for what felt like minutes, but must have been mere seconds. It made no move to approach, yet I felt its attention like a physical weight. Its chest expanded with deep, controlled breathing after the exertion of pacing me. The sound carried across the empty street, a rasping inhalation too deep and resonant for its frame, as though the lungs inside were larger than its exterior suggested possible. The creature's fur appeared matted and coarse, a color that blended perfectly with the dead prairie grass surrounding it. Not the rich brown or gray of healthy wildlife, but a sickly yellowish tan, like vegetation left too long without water. It seemed simultaneously solid and insubstantial, as though it might dissolve back into the landscape that had concealed it. What happened next broke the paralysis that had momentarily overtaken me. The thing tilted its head slightly, a terrifyingly human gesture of curiosity, and took one deliberate step forward. The movement conveyed clear intent, and survival instinct finally overcame my shocked immobility. I wrenched my attention away and pedaled with renewed desperation toward the underpass. My tires squealed against the pavement as I took the turn too quickly, nearly losing control. The darkness of the tunnel loomed before me, and for an instant I hesitated. What if it was waiting there, using the underpass to trap me? No choice remained but forward movement. I plunged into the tunnel, the sound of my breathing and bicycle wheels echoing chaotically off the concrete walls. The distance through the underpass was perhaps 30 meters, but it stretched endlessly before me. Darkness broken only by my bike's front light casting disturbing, elongated shadows. Halfway through, terror compelled me to look back. The entrance to the tunnel framed a silhouette, the creature standing upright at the mouth of the underpass. It made no move to follow, but watched with that same terrible intentness. The message seemed clear. It could pursue if it wished, but was choosing not to. The boundary, perhaps the proximity to more populated areas beyond, had given it pause. I emerged from the opposite side, gasping for breath, and found myself on familiar streets lined with houses and apartments. Distant traffic sounds provided comfort, the reassuring noise of normal human activity. When I glanced back one final time, the tunnel entrance stood empty. The remaining distance home passed in a blur of frantic pedaling. I ran red lights, cut across lanes without checking for cars, and pushed my speed beyond safety. Nothing mattered except putting distance between myself and what I'd seen. I arrived home drenched in sweat, hands trembling so badly I struggled to lock my bike in the garage. The house stood dark, except for the porch light my parents always left on when I was out. I fumbled with my keys at the door, dropped them twice before managing to insert them in the lock, and practically fell into the entryway. The normalcy of our family home, the familiar smell of furniture polish my mother used, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the family photos lining the hallway, created a surreal contrast to what I'd just experienced. I stood in the darkened entryway, back pressed against the closed door, struggling to regulate my breathing and organize my thoughts. My phone vibrated in my pocket, Jeremy texting to check if I'd made it home. I pulled it out, stared at the screen without comprehension for several seconds, then managed to type, "Home safe," with shaking fingers. The mundane exchange felt impossibly distant from my current reality. Sleep was out of the question. I moved through the house like a ghost, checking window locks, peeking through blinds at the empty street, starting at every normal house sound. I finally settled on the living room couch, unwilling to go upstairs to my bedroom with its windows overlooking the backyard. I left the TV on with the volume low, needing the comfort of human voices and light. Morning arrived after what felt like years. I must have eventually succumbed to exhaustion because I woke to sunlight streaming through windows and my mother's concerned expression as she stood over me. "Paul? Why are you sleeping down here? Are you feeling okay?" I blinked up at her, the previous night's terror momentarily forgotten, then rushing back in a flood of adrenaline. I got in late. Didn't want to wake anyone." She frowned, not believing me, but not pushing further. "You're pale. Are you coming down with something?" "Maybe." The excuse was welcome. Just tired. In daylight, surrounded by normality, doubt began to creep in. Had I actually seen what I thought I saw? The human mind can play extraordinary tricks, especially in darkness, when primed by stories and operating under fatigue. Perhaps it had been a large dog, and my imagination had transformed it into something more sinister. Or maybe someone had been walking their German Shepherd and stopped to watch me pass. The transformation from 4 legs to 2, merely the owner standing up from crouching beside their pet. These rationalizations provided temporary comfort, but couldn't entirely dispel the memory of those eyes watching me with unnatural intelligence, or the wrongness of the proportions as it stood upright. Most disturbing was the purposefulness of its behavior, the precise way it had paced me while remaining hidden, revealing itself only at the boundary where my escape was assured. I spent the day in a fog, moving mechanically through household chores, responding to texts from friends with brief, uninformative replies. My parents exchanged concerned glances, but attributed my behavior to typical teenage moodiness or possible illness. That evening, I researched local wildlife on my laptop. Regina has coyotes in surrounding areas, occasionally venturing into parks, but nothing approaching the size of what I'd seen. Wolves are extremely rare in the region. No bears had been reported near the city in decades. I expanded my search to include cryptid legends and found myself on websites discussing dogmen sightings across North America. The descriptions matched disturbingly well with what I'd encountered. The height, the inappropriate proportions, the intelligence in the eyes, the tendency to track targets before revealing themselves. Many accounts mentioned the same yellowish-brown coloration I'd observed. Most disturbing were the maps showing clusters of sightings. While most concentrated in wooded regions of Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Pacific Northwest, a small but significant cluster appeared in the prairie provinces of Canada, particularly near boundaries between developed areas and open grassland. I discovered that around the same time as my encounter, local news had reported several pet disappearances in neighborhoods bordering Wascana Park. The articles attributed the incidents to coyotes or feral dogs, with animal control officials urging residents to keep pets indoors at night. One interview with a distraught pet owner described hearing something large moving through their yard before their dog disappeared without trace. The more I read, the more my certainty grew. What I had seen wasn't imagination or mistaken identity. Something existed in the liminal spaces of Regina. Something that most people would never encounter because they didn't venture into those boundary zones at the wrong hours. 3 years have passed since that night. I've never again taken that route after dark, rearranging my entire life to avoid being in certain areas at certain times. My friends noticed the change, how I became adamant about leaving gatherings before sunset, or insisting on driving rather than biking, even in perfect weather. Most attributed it to some undisclosed incident and eventually stopped questioning. Only Michael seemed to understand without explanation. When I finally mentioned having seen something unusual near Wascana Park, he didn't press for details but nodded with somber recognition. "Some things are better left unacknowledged," he said, then added more quietly, "Did it see you?" The question struck me as odd, yet perfectly aligned with my experience. "Yes," I answered. "It definitely saw me." Michael's expression darkened. "Be careful then. Recognition goes both ways." I've researched extensively since then, looking for scientific explanations or similar accounts. Zoologists dismiss the possibility of undiscovered large predators in populated areas. Psychologists suggest shared cultural narratives shape perception of ambiguous stimuli, explaining consistent descriptions across separate sightings. Yet neither explanation satisfies me. What I encountered possessed physicality and purpose that transcended hallucination or misidentification. The way it moved, the deliberate nature of its actions, the intelligence evident in its observation, these aspects cannot be dismissed as tricks of light or imagination. I've spoken with Jasmine a few times since then. Without sharing my experience, I asked more about her community's understanding of the Rougarou and similar entities. "Our elders say these beings exist in between, not fully of this world or another," she explained. "They're drawn to thresholds, to people who walk the edges. Some believe seeing them marks you somehow." "Marks you how?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She considered before answering. "As someone who has glimpsed beyond normal perception, it creates a connection, an awareness that flows both ways." Her words resonated uncomfortably. Since that night, I've experienced moments of inexplicable unease, sudden certainty of being watched when alone in open spaces, even in broad daylight. Dreams where I'm running along endless prairie paths with something keeping pace just beyond sight. The sensation intensifies near boundaries, where urban development meets natural spaces, where light gives way to darkness. I'm 19 now, preparing for university next fall. I've chosen a campus in Vancouver, as far from the prairies as I can reasonably go while staying in Canada. Perhaps distance will weaken whatever connection was established that night. Perhaps different terrain, different boundaries, will offer protection that familiarity cannot. But in quiet moments, when I'm most honest with myself, I acknowledge the truth. What I saw changed me fundamentally. Not because it revealed monsters exist, but because it revealed the world is not what we pretend it to be. Reality has seams, places where the familiar gives way to something else. Most people move through life never glimpsing these ruptures. I no longer have that luxury. Having seen beyond the veil, I cannot unsee it. And sometimes, in the moment between wakefulness and sleep, I'm overwhelmed by the certainty that something waits patiently for our paths to cross again, something that remembers me as clearly as I remember it. The prairies hold secrets beneath their seeming emptiness. They conceal watchers in the waving grass. I know this now, and the knowledge itself forms a boundary I can never recross, separating who I was before that night from who I have become since. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. I never wanted to move to Pine Ridge. In April of 2019, my mother Joanne packed our belongings into 2 weathered suitcases, herding my siblings and me into our rusted station wagon. We fled our home in Massachusetts under the cover of darkness, escaping my father's violent outbursts and broken promises. "It'll be different this time," Mom promised, her knuckles white against the steering wheel as we crossed state lines. I watched her eyes in the rearview mirror, hollow but determined. At 16, I understood what we were running from, but my younger siblings, Melody 12 years, Adam 10 years, and Ben 5 years, only knew we were going on an adventure. Pine Ridge was a forgotten logging town nestled in the Appalachian foothills. Dense forests surrounded clusters of homes, most in various states of disrepair. Cabin 8 at the Pinewood Lodge would become our sanctuary, a modest 2-story structure with faded yellow paint and creaking floorboards that whispered with every step. The caretaker, Mr. Wilson, handed Mom the keys with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rent's due first of the month. Keep to yourselves and you'll do fine here." His gaze lingered on us children before he trudged back to his office at the front of the property. Our neighbors kept their distance those first few weeks. The O'Malleys in cabin 7 nodded politely, but rarely spoke. The Huttons across the way had a boy named Justin about Adam's age, but his mother watched him like a hawk whenever he ventured outside. Mom found work at the local diner, serving breakfast to truckers passing through on Route 16. I enrolled at Pine Ridge High School, where students stared at me with undisguised curiosity. The outsider, the newcomer with secrets. Everyone has something to hide in Pine Ridge. A girl named Heidi whispered to me during lunch my first day. You'll learn that soon enough. I dismissed her warning as small-town paranoia. We'd escaped the danger. We were safe now, building a new life away from Dad's rage. Cabin 8 might have been drafty, with water stains spreading across the ceiling and windows that rattled in the wind. But it was ours. How wrong I was to think we'd found safety. If I could go back to those early days, I'd pack our bags and drive until Pine Ridge was nothing but a distant speck in our rearview mirror. But hindsight offers no salvation, only regret that festers like an open wound. By summer, our lives had fallen into a predictable rhythm. Mom worked double shifts while I watched my siblings. Melody, ever the responsible one, helped with household chores. Adam made friends with Justin Hutton despite Mrs. Hutton's obvious disapproval. Ben adjusted the quickest, finding wonder in the forest that bordered our backyard. Don't go past the creek, I warned them daily. Something about those woods made my skin crawl. Perhaps the unnatural silence that descended when you ventured too far in, or the way shadows seemed to move independently of the trees that cast them. Our neighbors remained distant, though Mr. Wilson sometimes lingered near our cabin, watching us through cigarette smoke. When questioned about repairs, the bathroom sink that perpetually dripped or the back door that wouldn't lock properly, he'd promised to get around to it before disappearing for days. I befriended Heidi from school, though her peculiar intensity sometimes unnerved me. She knew everything about everyone in Pine Ridge, including details that seemed impossible for a teenager to access. The Huttons moved here after their oldest son disappeared, she told me one afternoon as we walked home. And Mr. Wilson? He served time for something bad, real bad. Records are sealed, though. How do you know all this? I asked. She shrugged. My mom works at the county clerk's office. I listen. In July, Mom brought home a man named Ray, who worked as a mechanic at the garage by the diner. He had weathered hands and a gentle smile, but his eyes held a sadness I recognized from my own reflection. They'd sit on our porch after dinner, speaking in hushed tones while nursing beers. I like him, Melody confessed one night as we washed dishes. He fixed my bike without asking for anything. I remained skeptical. Men like my father had taught me to question kindness that came without conditions. As summer waned, strange occurrences began plaguing our cabin. Items moved overnight. Ben's teddy bear relocated to the kitchen table, Mom's work shoes found in the bathtub. The telephone rang at odd hours, silent on the other end. I'd wake to find doors we'd closed standing open, windows we'd locked unlatched. Old houses settle. Mom dismissed my concerns. The wind plays tricks. But it wasn't the house or the wind that left muddy footprints in the hallway one morning in August. It wasn't natural forces that carved a small, precise X into our front door while we slept. Something was marking us, watching us, waiting. By September, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Walking home from school, I'd feel eyes tracking my movement through the trees. At night, shadows passed beneath our windows, too deliberate to be wildlife. Mom dismissed my concerns. You've always had an active imagination, she said, distracted by bills spread across the kitchen table. Work had slowed at the diner as tourist season ended, and her smile grew more strained with each passing day. Ray began staying overnight occasionally. I'd hear their hushed arguments through the thin walls, something about money and the job and whether it was worth the risk. When confronted, Mom assured me everything was fine. Ray's just helping us get ahead, she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, a tell I recognized from childhood, her signal that she wasn't being entirely truthful. One Tuesday afternoon in early October, I returned from school to find Mrs. Hutton waiting on our porch. Her face was drawn, eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. Keep your little ones close, she whispered, gripping my arm. There's talk in town. Bad people coming around again. What people? What are you talking about? She shook her head. History repeats. We didn't listen last time, just be careful. She hurried away, looking over her shoulder repeatedly. That evening, I relayed the conversation to Mom. Ray, who'd been fixing our leaky faucet, straightened abruptly. Marnie Hutton needs to mind her business, he snapped, exchanging a look with Mom I couldn't interpret. It's nothing, Mom assured me. Small towns breed gossip. 2 days later, Justin Hutton stopped coming to school. When Adam asked to visit him, Mrs. Hutton informed us through a barely opened door that they were leaving town for a while. The next morning, their cabin stood empty, curtains drawn. Heidi had her own theories. It happens every few years, she explained during lunch. Families just up and leave. No notice, no goodbyes. My mom says it's the anniversary effect. Anniversary of what? The incident, she whispered, leaning closer. Back in '92, a whole family was killed right here in Pine Ridge. Cabin 10, just 2 doors down from you. They never caught who did it. My blood went cold. Why wouldn't anyone tell us this? Bad for business, she shrugged. Besides, who'd want to relive that? The younger kids were... She stopped suddenly, looking past me. Your brother's waiting for you. Adam stood in the cafeteria doorway, his face unusually pale. Mom called the school. We need to go home now. By the time we arrived, 3 police cruisers were parked outside our cabin. Officers combed the perimeter while Mom spoke with a detective on the porch, her voice rising in panic. Someone broke in while I was at work, she explained when she saw us. They didn't take anything valuable, just rearranged things. Left a message. What message? I demanded. Her eyes met mine, fear naked on her face. Welcome home. October 18th, 2019. The date is seared into my memory. The last night of normalcy, the dividing line between before and after. Rain lashed against the windows as Mom prepared for her evening shift. Ray was coming over to watch us, a plan that irritated me. At 16, I was perfectly capable of looking after my siblings. I don't need a babysitter, I protested. He's not coming for you, Mom said, applying lipstick in the hallway mirror. There's been break-ins all over town. I'd feel better knowing an adult is here. Melody had arranged to sleep at her friend's house across the property. Katie's mom said I could stay for dinner, she pleaded, already packing her overnight bag. Mom hesitated. Be back by noon tomorrow, and call when you get there. After they left, I helped Adam with homework while Ben watched cartoons. Ray arrived at 7, soaked from the rain and carrying a paper bag from the liquor store. Got movies for the kids, he announced, producing a stack of DVDs alongside his six-pack. He seemed on edge, checking his watch repeatedly and peering through the curtains at intervals. Expecting someone? I finally asked. Just jumpy with this weather, he muttered. Lock the back door, will you? At 9, I put Ben to bed, reading until his breathing deepened into sleep. Adam followed shortly after, exhausted from a math test earlier that day. I retreated to my room to finish an English essay, but my concentration kept breaking as Ray paced the living room below, the floorboards announcing each nervous circuit. The rain intensified around midnight. Between thunderclaps, I heard voices, Ray's, tight with controlled anger, and others I didn't recognize. Male voices, at least 2 of them. Their conversation rose and fell, never quite audible enough to discern words. I crept to my door, cracking it open. The voices went silent immediately. Then Ray called up, falsely cheerful. Everything okay up there? Fine, I answered, retreating back to bed but leaving my door ajar. More murmuring followed, then heavy footsteps on the stairs. I feigned sleep as my door pushed open, light from the hallway spilling across my bed. Someone stood watching me for long seconds before withdrawing. The house fell silent. Too silent in that unnatural way that signals something amiss rather than true quiet. I fought the urge to investigate, terror and curiosity waging war inside me. Terror won. I stayed in bed, listening to the blood pounding in my ears. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I jolted awake to a sound I still hear in nightmares. A single, choked cry from downstairs, abruptly silenced. Then the distinctive thud of something heavy hitting the floor. My bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness broken only by hushed movement below. Drawers opening, cupboards closing, water running. I lay frozen, paralyzed by certainty that any movement would alert whoever was downstairs to my wakefulness. Minutes stretched into an hour as I listened to them methodically moving through our home. Finally, the back door opened and closed. Car doors slammed in the distance. Only when silence had truly descended did I allow myself to breathe normally again. Morning would reveal what darkness concealed, and morning would destroy every remnant of the life we'd tried to build. The insistent beeping of my alarm clock at 6:30 a.m. seemed obscene after such a night. Sunlight streamed through my window, mockingly cheerful. For a blissful moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed the entire episode, the voices, the thud, the searching. Then I noticed the silence. No cartoons blaring as Ben typically demanded first thing. No Ray snoring on the couch where he usually crashed. Not even the routine sounds of plumbing protests as someone showered. I pulled on a sweatshirt and stepped into the hallway. Adam and Ben's door stood ajar, their room empty, beds unmade. Fear clutched at my throat as I called their names, my voice echoing in the still house. The staircase creaked under my weight. Halfway down, a metallic smell hit me, copper and salt, unmistakable even to someone who had never encountered it in such quantity before. At the bottom step, I froze. The living room had been transformed into something from a nightmare, furniture overturned, walls spattered with crimson arcs and splashes, and in the center of it all, Ray lay sprawled on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, a dark cavity where his throat should have been. His chest was a ruined landscape of punctures and tears, the white of bone visible through shredded flesh. A hoarse sound escaped me. Not quite a scream, something more primal. I stumbled backward, colliding with the wall, unable to process what I was seeing. Adam? Ben? My voice cracked as I called for my brothers, praying they had somehow escaped whatever happened here. The kitchen yielded no answers, just more blood on the linoleum and a knife block with 2 slots empty. I forced myself to check every room, moving on autopilot, my mind retreating from the horror even as my eyes registered it. I found Adam in the downstairs bathroom, curled in the tub as if seeking shelter. His pajamas were saturated with blood, his small face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Defensive wounds marked his hands and forearms. He had fought his attacker. Ben wasn't in the house. Neither was Melody, safely away at her sleepover. Small mercies that felt like nothing in the face of such devastation. Operating on instinct, I stumbled to the phone and dialed 911, my voice mechanical as I reported what I'd found. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking questions I answered without comprehension. When sirens wailed in the distance, I walked outside and sat on the porch steps, staring blankly at the morning sun glinting off dew-covered grass. Within minutes, our quiet property became a chaos of police cruisers, ambulances, and eventually, crime scene vans. Officers cordoned off our cabin with yellow tape while neighbors emerged to stare, hands covering mouths in shock or whispers. Detective Russell Mason arrived an hour later, a heavyset man with penetrating eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. He sat beside me on the steps, neither too close nor too distant. "I need to ask you some difficult questions," he said, voice gentle yet firm. "Can you help me understand what happened here?" For the next 2 hours, I recounted everything. Our move to Pine Ridge, Ray's relationship with Mom, the strange occurrences leading up to last night, and the voices I'd heard. As I spoke, I watched officers carrying sealed evidence bags from our home, each potentially containing some fragment of the life that had been shattered overnight. "Where's my mother?" I finally asked. "Someone needs to tell her." Mason's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "We're trying to locate her now." "When did you last see her?" "She left for work around 6 last night. The diner, she works the evening shift." He nodded, making a note. "And she didn't come home last night?" A new fear bloomed inside me. "She sometimes stays with friends if she works late. Have you checked the diner?" "We're checking everywhere," he assured me, but something in his tone made my stomach clench. I learned later that Mom never arrived for her shift. Her car was found abandoned at a rest stop 50 miles north, keys still in the ignition. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, untouched. And Ben, my sweet innocent brother, remained missing, his absence a wound that bled hope with each passing hour. The days following the murders blurred together in a haze of police interviews, funeral arrangements, and unanswerable questions. Melody and I moved into a temporary foster home in town while the investigation continued. She barely spoke, her eyes vacant, occasionally asking when Mom would come get us, a question I couldn't bear to answer honestly. Detective Mason became a constant presence, sometimes sitting silently with us, other times gently probing for any remembered detail that might help their investigation. I learned to recognize the slight furrow in his brow that appeared whenever I mentioned Ray's mysterious friends, or the break-in days before the murders. "We found something interesting," he told me 2 weeks after that night. We sat in his cluttered office at the police station, away from Melody's ears. Ray Winters wasn't his real name. He was Raymond Garrett, wanted in 3 states for fraud and suspected involvement in organized crime. I stared at the mugshot he slid across the desk, Ray looking younger, harder, his eyes calculating rather than sad. Was he the one who... We don't think so. The evidence suggests multiple perpetrators, and Ray was definitely one of the victims. This was professional work. Mason chose his words carefully. We believe your family got caught in something bigger than you realize. Headlines in the local paper screamed, Pine Ridge Horror, History Repeats, and Cabin Murders Echo 1992 Tragedy. Journalists camped outside the police station, shouting questions whenever I appeared. Locals whispered when I passed, their curiosity and pity equally unbearable. Heidi was the only person from school who visited, bringing homework assignments and unlikely theories about what happened. The town has secrets, she insisted during one visit. My mom says these cabins should have been demolished years ago, too much bad history. 1 month after the murders, they found Ben's backpack in the woods, 5 miles from our cabin. Inside was his favorite dinosaur toy and a child's drawing of what appeared to be 3 stick figures standing around a house. No other trace of him emerged, despite extensive searches. Mom remained missing. Her identification was discovered at a bus terminal in Cincinnati, but security cameras yielded no footage of her. It was as if she had simply vanished, a possibility that haunted me more than confirmation of her death might have. Nights were worst. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, I jerked awake, convinced I'd heard footsteps on the stairs or whispers outside my window. The foster home's locked doors and security system offered no comfort against the demons that had already proven they could find us anywhere. Winter descended on Pine Ridge, snow blanketing the forests and the abandoned Cabin 8, which remained sealed with police tape even as the investigation stalled. I watched from afar as icicles formed on its eaves, nature reclaiming what humanity had defiled. On Christmas Eve, Detective Mason visited with a small gift for Melody, a dollhouse she'd mentioned wanting, and news he delivered quietly while she played in another room. We found blood evidence in the woods, he said. It matches your mother's DNA. I'm sorry. I nodded, oddly numb. And Ben? He shook his head. Nothing conclusive. We'll keep looking. As snow fell outside, I realized part of me had died in that cabin along with Adam and Ray. The person I'd been before, the 16-year-old with dreams and petty concerns, was gone, replaced by someone who understood how quickly safety could become an illusion, how thoroughly evil could destroy everything you loved. Will you ever find who did this? I asked Mason as he prepared to leave. He paused at the door, his expression somber. I promise you this, I won't stop looking until I do. A promise I clung to through the darkest nights, even as I began to understand that some mysteries remain unsolved, some wounds never heal, and some predators never face justice. January 2022. I turned 19 in a small apartment in Burlington, 3 hours and a lifetime away from Pine Ridge. Melody, now 15, had adapted better than anyone expected, throwing herself into schoolwork and dance classes with the resilience of youth. Our new guardian, Aunt Patricia, our mother's cousin who'd emerged from obscurity after the murders, provided stability, if not warmth. The investigation into what newspapers now called the Pine Ridge Massacre had gone cold. Detective Mason still called monthly with updates that weren't really updates, his voice increasingly apologetic. I'd stopped expecting closure but appreciated his stubborn refusal to abandon us. I deferred college, working instead at a local bookstore while attending therapy sessions mandated by victim services. The therapist called it complicated grief, mourning without resolution, healing without answers. She encouraged journaling, which I attempted half-heartedly, finding it impossible to translate horror into words. On the 3rd anniversary of that night, I received a plain manila envelope addressed to me at the bookstore rather than our home. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Our family standing outside Cabin 8 the day we moved in, smiling nervously at our fresh start. I hadn't seen this photo before. We hadn't owned a camera. Someone had been watching us from the beginning. On the back, written in neat block letters, "Still thinking of you." I took it directly to the police station, hands shaking. The detective assigned to our case since Mason's retirement studied it under bright lights. Postmarked from Cincinnati, he noted, like the other evidence. We'll run tests, but these things rarely yield prints. That night, unable to sleep, I searched online for anything related to Pine Ridge and the murders. Among dozens of articles I'd already read, one headline from a week earlier caught my attention. Human remains discovered in Appalachian wilderness. The article described hikers finding partial skeletal remains near an abandoned hunting cabin 60 miles from Pine Ridge. Authorities were working to identify the victim, believed to be a child between 7 years old. My heart pounded as I dialed Mason's home number, saved years ago but never used. He answered on the fourth ring, voice thick with sleep. "The remains they found," I said without preamble. "Is it Ben?" Silence stretched between us, then softly, "We're waiting on dental records, but yes, we believe so." I hung up without responding, something cold and resolute crystallizing inside me. For 3 years, I'd waited for justice to find us. Perhaps it was time to reverse the equation. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the library's public computers. Using techniques learned from true crime podcasts I'd obsessively consumed, I systematically researched everything connected to Pine Ridge: property records, obituaries, news archives. The pattern emerged slowly. Every decade or so, violence visited the cabins at Pine Ridge. Different victims, different circumstances, but similar brutality. In 1992, the incident Heidi had mentioned, a family of 4 found murdered, their youngest child missing. In 1981, a solitary hunter killed in Cabin 3. In 1972, a young couple vanished from Cabin 12, blood evidence suggesting foul play. Property records revealed what news stories didn't. The cabins had changed ownership multiple times, but one name appeared repeatedly as property manager: Wilson. 3 generations of the same family overseeing decades of bloodshed. I drove back to Pine Ridge the following day, telling Aunt Patricia I needed closure. The cabins looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier in winter's harsh light. Mr. Wilson still operated the front office, older now but with the same watchful eyes. He didn't recognize me at first, the traumatized girl now a solemn young woman. When recognition dawned, fear flickered across his features. "We're closed for renovations," he said, moving to shut the office door. I planted my foot in the jam. "I know about 1992, I said quietly. "And 1981, and 1972. His face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about. 3 generations of your family, 3 generations of murder. What are you, some kind of caretakers? Do you choose the families or just facilitate what happens to them?" "You should leave," he whispered, eyes darting past me to the empty parking lot. "They're always watching, always listening." "Who is?" But he shook his head, expression hardening into resolve. "Your family was marked the moment you arrived. I had tried to warn you, all of you, but nobody listens until it's too late." As I drove away, I noticed a black sedan pulling into the property. In my rearview mirror, I saw Mr. Wilson greeting the driver with the stiff formality of someone under duress. I'd disturbed something dormant, and now, I suspected, I had drawn its attention back to me. Spring arrived in Burlington with a sense of foreboding. The dental records confirmed what we already knew. The remains belonged to Ben. We buried him beside Adam in a quiet ceremony attended by the handful of people who constituted our diminished world. Afterward, standing alone at the graveside, I felt someone watching me. Turning, I saw Detective Mason observing from a respectful distance. "Thank you for coming," I said when he approached. "I made a promise." He hesitated. "There's something else you should know. We reopened the investigation into the 1992 murders based on similarities to your family's case. DNA technology has advanced significantly since then." Hope flickered weakly. "Did you find something?" "Blood evidence from both crime scenes shares familial markers. Whoever killed your brothers and Ray is related to whoever killed the family in 92. "The Wilsons," I whispered. Mason's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about the Wilsons?" I told him everything: my research, the pattern of violence, my confrontation with the property manager. As I spoke, his expression shifted from skepticism to dawning horror. "I need you to stay away from Pine Ridge," he said when I finished. "If what you're suggesting is true, you've put yourself in danger. Let us handle this." But the investigation moved too slowly, burdened by procedure and limited resources. I continued my own research, creating a timeline of disappearances and deaths connected to the cabins. Digital archives yielded newspaper clippings dating back to the property's construction in the 1950s, each decade marked by bloodshed, each incident investigated separately without recognizing the pattern. In May, I received another envelope, this one containing a yellowed photograph from what appeared to be the 1970s. A group of men stood before the newly constructed cabins, their faces solemn. I recognized the distinctive Wilson features in one young man. The others were unfamiliar except for one, an older man whose eyes held the same calculating coldness I'd seen in Ray's mugshot. On the back, someone had written, "The Covenant, 1972. I sent a scan to Mason, who called immediately. "Where did you get this?" "Same as before. Unmarked envelope, no return address." "The man on the right is Vincent Keller," Mason said, voice tight. "He ran organized crime operations throughout the region in the 70s and 80s. We suspected his organization used rural properties for money laundering and worse, but could never prove it. And Raymond Garrett, was connected to him? Garrett worked for Keller's successor. The organization never died, just evolved." Mason paused. "I think I understand now. The cabins are part of their infrastructure. The murders are either eliminations of witnesses or rituals of initiation. But why my family? We had nothing to do with them until Ray. Your mother may have known more than you realize. We found evidence she'd been in contact with federal investigators before your move to Pine Ridge. She may have been informing on Garrett." The truth hit like physical pain. Mom had led us into danger thinking she was escaping it. Ray wasn't our protector, he was our surveillance. And when whatever operation they were running required elimination of witnesses, we became expendable. 2 days later, Detective Mason disappeared. His car was found abandoned at a highway rest stop, keys in the ignition, just like Mom's had been. The investigation into his disappearance overtook the cold case he'd been pursuing, effectively burying any progress on our family's murders. I knew then that justice would never come through official channels. The organization, whatever they called themselves, had tentacles reaching into law enforcement, local government, anywhere that might threaten their operations. In June, I moved Melody to our aunt's sister's home in Canada, ensuring her safety before returning to face what I'd started. I rented a room in a motel 20 miles from Pine Ridge and began surveillance of my own, photographing visitors to the cabins, noting license plates, building the case no one else would pursue. On the anniversary of our arrival at Pine Ridge, I returned to Cabin 8, now renovated and rented to a new family with young children. I watched from the tree line as they unloaded luggage, their faces bright with the same hope we'd once had. Before dawn, I left an anonymous note on their windshield. "Leave today. Don't pack. Just go." Attached was the photograph of The Covenant and newspaper clippings of previous murders. They were gone by noon. That night, I noticed a black sedan parked near my motel, the same vehicle I'd seen at Pine Ridge months earlier. They had found me, just as I knew they eventually would. I write this account now, not knowing if anyone will ever read it. Tomorrow, I will confront what has haunted my family and countless others before us. I've sent copies of my research to journalists in 3 states with instructions to publish if I disappear. The truth about Pine Ridge deserves to be known, even if I'm not here to witness its revelation. Whatever covenant binds these men in blood has endured for generations, feeding on innocent lives while authorities look away or actively shield them. If you're reading this, I've either succeeded in exposing them or become their latest victim. Either way, remember this. Evil thrives not just in darkness, but in our collective willingness to look away from what we find unthinkable. Remember Adam's courage as he fought his attackers. Remember Ben's innocence, preserved even in death. Remember my mother, who tried to save us all. And if you ever find yourself driving through small towns with too many secrets and too few questions, keep going. Some destinations aren't meant to be reached. The Arizona wilderness stretched before me like a sleeping giant as I trudged deeper into the forest. My boots crunched over pine needles and fallen branches, each step taking me further from civilization and deeper into Apache land. The military-issue compass I carried seemed to wobble indecisively in my palm, as if the very earth beneath these ancient pines rejected modern instruments. I am Tarek White Eagle Johnson, though the Army knows me simply as Sergeant Johnson. My grandfather was full-blooded Chiricahua Apache, my grandmother Navajo, and they raised me on stories of these mountains after my parents died in a car crash when I was 7. Now I found myself back among the whispering pines that had populated my childhood dreams, though under circumstances I never could have imagined. 3 days ago, I had been stationed at Fort Huachuca, running training exercises and counting the days until my next leave. Then came the summons from Colonel Hayes, a special reconnaissance mission requiring someone with unique knowledge of the terrain. The briefing had been vague. Reports of unusual activity in the Coronado National Forest, possible foreign surveillance equipment, a need for someone who could move invisibly and understand the land. "We need someone who won't set off alarms with the locals, Johnson," Hayes had said, eyeing my features. "Someone who blends in." I almost laughed. The colonel thought my Apache blood would make me invisible among the trees, as if my military training hadn't already stripped away whatever connection I once had to this land. But I needed the bonus pay. The apartment in Tucson wasn't going to fix its own leaking roof, and my sister's college tuition wasn't getting any cheaper. So I nodded, accepted my orders, and prepared for a solitary trek into the mountains. Now, as the sun sank lower behind the towering pines, I realized I had grossly underestimated this mission. The coordinates I'd been given led me to increasingly remote areas, far from any hiking trails. The trees grew taller here, their massive trunks forming cathedral-like spaces between them. Shafts of golden light pierced through the canopy, illuminating dancing motes of dust and pollen. I checked my GPS again. The signal was weakening, but my destination appeared to be just beyond the next ridge. Some part of me, the part that still remembered my grandfather's warnings, felt uneasy. This was old land, sacred land, not a place for military operations. "Respect the mountains," he had told me. "They are older than memory, and they remember everything." As darkness began to settle, I spotted a small cabin nestled against the base of a cliff face. It wasn't on any of my maps and appeared long abandoned. The wooden structure sagged in places, with moss growing up its northern side. It would provide shelter for the night, at least. I approached cautiously, weapon ready. The door hung partially open, creaking softly in the evening breeze. Inside, a layer of dust covered everything. A small table, a wood stove, a single bed with a rotted mattress. No signs of recent occupation. Still, something felt off. The dust on the floor seemed disturbed in places, and there was a faint scent I couldn't identify. Musty and animal-like, but unlike any game I'd encountered before. Setting up my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the door, I prepared a cold dinner for my rations. No fire tonight, not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. As I ate, I pulled out the mission brief again, studying its sparse details. But my mind kept wandering to memories of my grandfather's stories, of the things that dwelled in these mountains since before the Apache arrived, of shadows that walked upright, of places where the barrier between worlds grew thin. Just folklore, I told myself. Stories to keep children from wandering too far from camp. Yet as night fully descended and the forest around the cabin grew deathly quiet, no insects chirping, no nocturnal animals rustling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from just beyond the cabin walls, something large, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time. Dawn broke reluctantly over the forest, gray light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. I had barely slept, jolted awake throughout the night by sounds I couldn't identify, heavy footfalls circling the cabin, rhythmic tapping on the outer walls, and once, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards beneath my sleeping bag. I packed quickly, eager to continue toward my coordinates and complete this mission. The sooner I could return to base, the better. As I shouldered my pack, something caught my eye. A marking carved into the wooden beam above the door. It resembled a handprint, but elongated, with fingers too numerous and joints bent at impossible angles. My grandfather would have recognized it. He had shown me similar markings once on ancient stones near our family's land. "Warning signs," he had called them. "Boundaries not to be crossed." Outside, the morning air hung heavy with mist. I checked my GPS again, only to find the signal completely gone. Even my compass seemed affected, the needle spinning lazily without finding north. Cursing under my breath, I pulled out my paper map and oriented myself by the sun's position. The coordinates I needed should be northeast, perhaps 4 miles further into the mountains. I hiked steadily uphill, the terrain growing steeper and more challenging. The forest changed character as I ascended, fewer pines, more twisted juniper and manzanita. The ground became rocky, with unexpected sinkholes and crevices forcing me to adjust my route frequently. By midday, I came upon a small stream cutting through the mountainside. I paused to refill my canteen, grateful for the clean, cold water. As I knelt by the stream's edge, I noticed unusual tracks in the soft mud of the opposite bank, wide, splayed impressions that resembled neither bear nor human, yet somehow suggested elements of both. My military training told me to document everything. I took photographs, placed my knife beside one print for scale. The impression was nearly 18 inches long, with what appeared to be 5 toes, though the front 2 seemed oddly fused. Whatever made it was heavy. The prints sank deep into the mud and moved on 2 legs, based on the stride pattern. I followed the stream upward, tracking the prints. They led toward a dark opening in the mountainside, a cave entrance partly concealed by overgrown brush. This had to be it, the location I'd been sent to investigate. According to my briefing, satellite imaging had detected unusual heat signatures emanating from this area, consistent with the energy output of surveillance equipment. The cave mouth yawned before me, a black slash in the mountain's face. The tracks led directly inside. Drawing my weapon and activating my flashlight, I stepped carefully into the darkness. The temperature dropped immediately. The air inside smelled of wet stone and something else, that same musky animal scent I'd detected in the cabin, but stronger here. My light revealed a passage that descended steeply into the earth, walls glistening with moisture. I moved cautiously, following the tracks deeper into the cave system. The passage widened into a chamber where stalactites hung like frozen daggers from the ceiling. My light couldn't reach the far walls, creating the unsettling impression that the space continued infinitely into darkness. Water dripped somewhere, the sound echoing oddly. As I advanced, my foot struck something that skittered across the stone floor. I directed my light downward. Bones. Hundreds of them scattered across the cave floor like fallen branches after a storm. Most appeared to be animal deer and elk, judging by the antler fragments, but some larger ones gave me pause. Their shape and size suggested something else entirely. In the center of the chamber stood what at first appeared to be a cairn of stones, but as I approached, I realized it was an arranged pile of skulls. Animal skulls formed the base, but crowning the macabre structure was something that turned my blood to ice water. A human skull, yellowed with age, with a neat circular hole drilled into its forehead. My grandfather had told me of this practice. Certain tribes once performed ritual trepanation on their dead, creating openings through which the spirit could escape. But this skull showed signs of something else. Deep scoring marks along the cranium that no stone tool could have made. They resembled claw marks, as if something had tried to extract what lay within. As I stood transfixed by this discovery, I became aware of a sound echoing through the chamber, a rhythmic scraping, like heavy nails dragging across stone. It came from deeper within the cave, from a dark passage I hadn't noticed before, and it was getting closer. I retreated into the shadows along the chamber wall, extinguishing my light. Military training took over. Assess, adapt, overcome. The scraping sound continued, accompanied now by heavy breathing that echoed wetly off the stone walls. Whatever approached was large and moved with deliberate slowness. A faint phosphorescence began to illuminate the chamber, some kind of fungus or lichen on the walls responding to the disturbance. In that ghostly blue-green glow, I saw it emerge from the deeper passage. At first, my mind struggled to process what my eyes beheld. It walked upright on 2 powerful legs, standing well over 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, dark as pine bark. But it was the creature's proportions that defied comprehension. Arms too long, reaching nearly to the ground. A torso too broad and hunched. A head that seemed to sit directly on massive shoulders with barely any neck visible. The face. I could only glimpse it in profile as the creature moved across the chamber. But what I saw haunted me. Not quite human, not quite animal. A heavy brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes. The jaw protruded, revealing teeth when it opened its mouth to scent the air. This was no man in a costume. No bear walking upright. This was something else entirely. Something that walked the blurred line between legend and reality. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the old one. My grandfather's people had many names for the forest guardian, the shadow walker. I had dismissed them as stories meant to explain the unexplainable sounds in the night. Now I was frozen in its presence. The creature paused at the pile of skulls, reaching down with hands that seemed almost human but far larger, with blackened nails like curved talons. It adjusted the human skull at the top, turning it to face the entrance through which I had come. A deliberate warning. I remained motionless, controlling my breathing, willing my heart to quiet its thundering in my chest. The creature hadn't detected me yet, but I knew its senses would be sharper than mine. Any movement, any sound, might trigger a confrontation I couldn't hope to win. Minutes passed like hours as the being moved about the chamber, occasionally stopping to scent the air. I noticed now that it seemed to be injured. It favored its right side, and something dark, possibly blood, matted the fur along its flank. Finally, it gathered something from the ground animal bones that it clutched to its chest and retreated back through the dark passage. The scraping sound faded gradually until silence reclaimed the cave. I waited 10 more minutes before daring to move, then carefully reactivated my flashlight, keeping the beam directed downward. The mission had suddenly taken on an entirely different dimension. Was this what I had been sent to find? Did the military somehow know about this creature? I thought of the coordinates, the vague briefing, the unusual tracks. Perhaps reports of the creature had been misinterpreted as signs of human intruders. Or perhaps someone knew exactly what dwelled in these caves and wanted confirmation. Either way, I needed to document everything. I photographed the skull arrangement, the tracks, the claw marks on the stone walls. Then, against all better judgment, I decided to follow the passage where the creature had disappeared. The tunnel descended sharply, requiring me to half climb, half slide down its slick surface. The air grew warmer, more humid, carrying a stronger musk that caught in my throat. After about 30 meters, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but equally disturbing. What I found there wasn't surveillance equipment or foreign operatives, but something far more ancient. The walls were covered with pictographs, red ochre handprints, stick figures of humans, and larger looming figures that matched what I had just witnessed. Some images depicted what appeared to be hunting scenes, the tall figures pursuing deer and smaller humans fleeing before them. But the central image, taking up the largest section of wall, showed something different. Humans and the tall beings standing together, arms raised toward a spiral symbol that I recognized from my grandfather's teachings. It represented a doorway between worlds. Below this mural, arranged carefully on a natural stone shelf, sat several artifacts that made my heart sink. Modern items, a digital camera, its casing cracked open, a backpack torn to shreds, hiking boots with the laces still tied, and most disturbingly, a military-issue canteen with initials carved into its side, RM. Richard Martinez. The name clicked into place, a specialist who had gone missing during a training exercise in these mountains 3 months ago. The official report claimed he had deserted, but rumors around base suggested something stranger had occurred. I was photographing these findings when a low growl reverberated through the chamber. I spun around, my light catching reflective eyes at the tunnel entrance. Not the large creature from before, but something smaller, though similar in form. A juvenile, perhaps. It charged without warning, moving with shocking speed across the chamber. I fired a warning shot that echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space. But the creature didn't slow. In desperation, I dodged sideways, losing my balance on the uneven floor. I fell hard, my head striking stone, and darkness claimed me. I awoke to pain, a throbbing behind my eyes and a sharp sting along my left arm. Disoriented, I reached for my flashlight, only to find it missing. But I wasn't in darkness. A strange, diffuse light illuminated my surroundings, emanating from what appeared to be jars of bioluminescent fungi positioned around what I now realized was a completely different cave chamber. Attempting to sit up, I discovered my situation had deteriorated significantly. My pack, weapon, and most of my equipment were gone. Worse, my left arm sported 3 parallel gashes from shoulder to elbow, hastily bound with what looked like strips of my own torn shirt. "Stay still," a voice whispered from the shadows. "They hear everything." I froze, squinting toward the source. A figure emerged, human, male, bearded and gaunt. His clothes hung in tatters, and his eyes held the wild look of someone who had spent too long in darkness. "Martinez?" I ventured. He flinched at the name, then nodded slightly. "What's left of him? They sent you to find me?" "No," I admitted. "I didn't even know you were here. I was sent to investigate possible surveillance equipment." Martinez laughed, a dry, broken sound. "That's their cover story. They know what's out here. They've always known." He moved closer, and I could see how emaciated he had become. His right leg dragged slightly, badly healed from some previous injury. "How long have you been down here?" I asked. "I stopped counting after 50 days, he replied. "Time works differently in their territory. You crossed the boundary, same as I did." Their territory? The creatures? Not creatures. Martinez cut me off sharply. People. Ancient people. The first people, if you believe their stories. They were here before us. Before the Navajo. Before the Apache. They retreated underground when humans became too numerous. I thought of my grandfather's stories again. Tales of the ancient ones who dwelled in the hollow places beneath the mountains. Stories I had dismissed as mythology, designed to explain natural phenomena or enforce tribal boundaries. How do you know all this? I asked. Martinez pointed to his temple. They showed me. They can put thoughts in your head. Images. Not words exactly, but you understand anyway. He shuddered. It's why they take the skulls. It helps them connect. My stomach churned at the implication. Are they going to kill us? If they wanted us dead, we wouldn't be talking now, Martinez said. They're curious. We're different from the others who've wandered in. Military training, maybe, or because we didn't run. I examined our prison more carefully. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with a single entrance blocked by what appeared to be a crude door fashioned from interwoven branches and animal hide. The walls glistened with moisture, and strange symbols had been scratched into the stone, similar to those I'd seen in the pictograph chamber. Have you tried to escape? I asked, keeping my voice low. Martinez's eyes darted nervously to the door. 3 times. Made it to the surface once. That's how I got this. He gestured to his damaged leg. There's a whole network of tunnels, stretching for miles under the mountain. Some natural, some carved out over centuries. They know every passage. We don't. A scraping sound outside the chamber silenced us both. Martinez retreated to the shadows, motioning for me to lie down and feign unconsciousness. I complied, closing my eyes to slits, watching through my lashes as the branch door swung open. The creature that entered was the smaller one that had attacked me, its movements more agile than the larger being I'd encountered earlier. It carried something in its arms, my pack, I realized, which it dropped unceremoniously in the center of the chamber. Then, to my astonishment, it spoke. The sounds weren't English or any human language I recognized. They resembled something between animal grunts and the clacking of stones, yet they carried distinct patterns, communication, not random noise. When neither of us responded, the being approached me directly. I fought to remain still as it crouched beside me, its musky scent overwhelming. A hand, too large, too strong, with fingers too long, gripped my injured arm, unwinding the makeshift bandage. Through barely open eyes, I watched as it examined my wounds, then reached into a pouch at its waist, withdrawing a handful of green paste that it applied to the gashes. The substance burned initially, then went curiously numb. The being rewrapped my arm with fresh material. Not my shirt this time, but some kind of soft, fibrous plant matter. Throughout this procedure, it continued making those clicking, guttural sounds as if speaking to itself. When it finished, it turned toward my pack, rummaging through the contents. It removed my camera, turning the device over curiously before setting it aside. Next came my military ID and documents, which it studied intently. Finally, it extracted my satellite phone, which it examined briefly before crushing the device effortlessly in one hand. Message received, no calling for help. After the being departed, Martinez emerged from his hiding place, his expression grim. That one's called Nakohe, he said. The healer. It's been patching me up whenever I get injured trying to escape. He nodded toward my newly bandaged arm. That paste will prevent infection. They know medicines we've forgotten. I examined the bandage, expertly applied, with even pressure across the wound. You understand their language? Some words. They've been teaching me. Martinez tapped his head again. Through pictures, mostly. They're not all the same. Some want to help us. Others want to... He trailed off. Want to what? I pressed. Martinez's eyes met mine, hollow with fear. Use us. Study us. They believe we're related somehow. Distant cousins who took a different path. They want to understand why we've forgotten the old ways, forgotten them. I thought of the skull with the hole drilled into it, by examining our brains. He nodded slowly. The elder, the big one you must have seen, he's the one who decides our fate, and tonight is their council meeting. What happens at the council? Martinez's voice dropped to a whisper. They decide which of us lives, which of us joins the skull pile, and which of us becomes like them. Becomes like them? What does that mean? But Martinez had retreated into himself, rocking slightly, his eyes unfocused. Whatever he had witnessed during his captivity had broken something fundamental within him. As I sat back against the cold stone wall, I realized the true nature of my mission was likely known to my superiors all along. I wasn't sent to find surveillance equipment. I was sent to find answers. Answers about what happened to Martinez. Answers about what lurked in these mountains. And I had found those answers, though I now doubted I would ever live to report them. Hours passed in tense silence. Martinez alternated between periods of lucidity, where he shared fragmented information about our captors, and stretches of withdrawn catatonia where he simply stared at the luminescent fungi, mumbling to himself. From his scattered accounts, I pieced together a disturbing narrative. These beings, he called them the Zi-Na-Ne, or Ancient Ones, had once dominated the surface world. They were intelligent, with complex social structures and their own form of spirituality centered around what Martinez described as the knowledge in blood and bone. As humans proliferated, the Zi-Na-Ne retreated underground, emerging only at night to hunt and gather. They considered certain territories, particularly caves and mountain passes, sacred boundaries between their world and ours. Trespassers were rarely tolerated. "Why keep us alive?" I asked during one of Martinez's clearer moments. "Some believe we carry old memories in our blood," he explained. "Memories of when our kinds lived together. The Elder wants to extract these memories." "Through trepanation," I murmured, remembering the skull. Martinez nodded grimly. "Not all survive the process." I examined our prison more methodically, searching for weaknesses. The door, despite its primitive appearance, was secured from the outside with a mechanism I couldn't reach. The walls offered no alternative exits, solid stone with no fissures large enough to exploit. "What about your radio?" Martinez asked suddenly. "Did they take it?" I patted my pockets, realizing with a surge of hope that they hadn't found my backup communication device, a small emergency transmitter concealed in a hidden pocket of my combat pants. Standard issue for solo reconnaissance missions, it couldn't send voice messages but could transmit an emergency signal with GPS coordinates. "I've still got the emergency beacon," I told him, "but we'd need to get closer to the surface for the signal to reach anyone." Martinez's eyes widened. "Tonight might be our only chance. During council, most of them gather in the central chamber. The passages are less guarded." Before I could respond, footsteps approached, heavier than before. We both retreated to opposite sides of the chamber as the door swung open, revealing the massive figure I'd first encountered by the skull pile. The Elder. It ducked to enter, its immense frame filling the space. In the bioluminescent light, I could see its features more clearly. A face that seemed to blend human and primate characteristics, yet was somehow neither. Deep-set eyes regarded us with unmistakable intelligence beneath a sloping forehead. Its mouth, when it opened, revealed teeth designed for an omnivorous diet, both flat molars and sharp canines. But most disturbing was its hands. Too articulated for an animal, with opposable thumbs and elongated fingers ending in thick, curved nails. Hands designed for tool use, for creation and destruction alike. The Elder carried a staff adorned with feathers, bones, and what appeared to be electronic components. Circuit boards and wiring that I recognized from modern devices. It pointed this staff at Martinez first, then at me, making those same guttural, clicking sounds I'd heard from the smaller one. To my shock, Martinez responded in kind, awkward approximations of the same language, his human vocal cords struggling with sounds they were never designed to produce. The Elder listened, then approached me directly. It reached out with one massive hand, and before I could react, pressed 3 fingers against my forehead. Pain exploded behind my eyes. Not physical pain, but a searing mental invasion that felt like ice picks driving into my brain. Images flooded my consciousness. Ancient forests untouched by human hands. Beings like the Elder gathering around fires, crafting tools. The arrival of the first human tribes. Conflict. Blood. Retreat underground. Centuries passing in darkness. Modern humans with machines, drilling, excavating, desecrating. Fear, anger, resolution. When the Elder withdrew its hand, I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The message had been unmistakable. A condensed history, a warning, and a judgment all conveyed in seconds. The Elder made a final pronouncement. Longer, more complex sounds, then departed, securing the door behind it. "What did it say?" I asked when I could speak again. Martinez's face had gone ashen. "Council begins at moonrise. Will be presented for judgment." He swallowed hard. "The Elder senses Apache blood in you. It believes you might carry older memories, memories of when our peoples made peace. And that's good? It means they might not kill you outright. Martinez looked away. But they'll still want what's in your head. Night was approaching. I could sense it even underground, a subtle shift in the air. If Martinez was right, our window for escape would come during the council meeting, when attention was focused elsewhere. I retrieved the emergency transmitter from my hidden pocket, a device no larger than a lighter, with a single button protected by a safety cap. We need a distraction, I said, formulating a plan. Something to draw them away from the passages leading to the surface. Martinez's gaze fell on the jars of bioluminescent fungi. These are sacred to them, he said. They harvest them from a special chamber and cultivate them carefully. They're flammable when dried. I understood immediately. We create a controlled fire, enough smoke to trigger alarm, but not enough to cause a cave-in. While they're responding, we make for the surface. For the first time, a spark of hope appeared in Martinez's haunted eyes. The path to the surface requires passing through the central chamber where they'll be gathering. There's another way, longer, through narrower passages, but I think I remember it. Together, we began preparations. Martinez showed me how to extract the phosphorescent material from several of the fungi jars, explaining that when dried and concentrated, it created a slow-burning but smoke-heavy fire. Meanwhile, I tore strips from my remaining clothes to create fuses of varying lengths. As we worked, Martinez spoke of his months in captivity, of witnessing rituals where the Sinane danced around fires, consuming substances that sent them into trances, of seeing them craft intricate artworks on cave walls using pigments mixed with their own blood, of hearing their songs echo through the mountain, songs that sounded like Earth itself groaning. "They're dying out," he whispered. "Too few young ones, too little territory left. That's why they're desperate to extract our memories. They think there might be knowledge there, something they've forgotten that could save them." I thought of my grandfather then, of how he had mourned the fading of traditional Apache ways, the loss of language and ceremony with each passing generation, of how he had taught me what he could, knowing it was but a fraction of what had once been. Perhaps these beings felt the same desperation, watching their ancient culture slip away beneath the inexorable advance of modern humanity. But sympathy wouldn't save us from having our skulls drilled open. As the subtle shifts in air current told us night had fallen above, we finalized our plan. Martinez would create a distraction near the food storage chambers, far from our escape route but crucial enough to draw attention. I would make my way toward the surface through the secondary passages he had described, transmitting the emergency signal once I reached sufficient depth. "What about you?" I asked as we prepared to implement our desperate plan. "We go together." Martinez glanced down at his damaged leg. "I'll slow you down, get to the surface, bring help." A bitter smile crossed his face. "I've survived this long. I can last a little longer." Before I could argue, we heard it, a distant rhythmic pounding. Drums or something like them. The council was beginning. It was time. The sound of drumming provided perfect cover as Martinez showed me how to manipulate the primitive door latch from inside, knowledge gained through months of observation. We slipped into the corridor, which was dimly lit by more of the bioluminescent fungi growing along the walls. "Remember the path," Martinez whispered, tracing a crude map in the dust on the floor. 3 left turns, then the narrow crevice that slopes upward. Follow the water seepage. It all flows down from the surface. He handed me several small bundles of the prepared fungal material, each with its own fuse. "Plant these at intervals. Light them only when you hear the commotion start. The smoke will create confusion. Cover your scent." The drumming grew louder, accompanied now by those same clicking, guttural vocalizations, dozens of voices joining together in what sounded like a primitive chant. We parted at the first junction, Martinez limping toward the food chambers while I moved in the opposite direction, counting passages and memorizing landmarks. The cave system was more extensive than I had imagined, with evidence of both natural formation and deliberate excavation. In some sections, modern human artifacts had been incorporated into the structure. Pieces of mining equipment, railroad spikes, even what appeared to be parts from a crashed aircraft, all repurposed to reinforce tunnels or create drainage systems. I planted the fungal bundles as instructed, tucking them into crevices at key junctions. The air grew progressively cooler as I ascended, giving me hope that I was indeed moving toward the surface. After navigating the 3rd left turn, I encountered the narrow crevice Martinez had described, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through sideways. It angled upward at about 45 degrees, with small hand and footholds worn into the stone. Evidence that this passage saw regular use. I was halfway up this crevice when I heard it. A distant roar followed by alarmed calls echoing through the cave system. Martinez had sprung his distraction. I quickly lit the fuses on my planted bundles using the waterproof matches from my survival kit, then continued upward with renewed urgency. Within minutes, the acrid smell of the burning fungus filled the passage, producing thick smoke that hugged the ceiling above me. The crevice opened onto a higher tunnel where I could stand upright again. Water trickled down one wall, a good sign according to Martinez's instructions. I followed it upward, moving as quickly as stealth allowed. Suddenly, ahead of me, a shadow moved. I froze, pressing myself against the wall, but it was too late. One of the smaller Tzinane, not much taller than a human but broader, stronger, stood blocking the passage. It carried no weapons but didn't need them. Its natural strength would be more than sufficient. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Then, to my astonishment, it stepped aside, gesturing upward with one long arm. Help from an unexpected quarter? Or a trap? I had no choice but to proceed, edging past the being cautiously. It made no move to stop me, instead pointing more insistently toward the passage ahead and uttering a single, urgent sound. I continued upward, hearing the creature fall in behind me, not pursuing, but following at a distance. The passage widened gradually, with thicker water flow and, most encouragingly, the first hints of fresher air. When I reached a chamber with a high ceiling lost in darkness, I activated the emergency transmitter, praying the signal would penetrate enough rock to reach the surface. The device blinked green twice confirmation that it was transmitting, before I tucked it securely back into my pocket. The being that had followed me emerged into the chamber, now gesturing toward a different passage than the one I'd been following. When I hesitated, it made an impatient sound, then reached out to grasp my uninjured arm, pulling me firmly toward the alternative route. Something in its manner, a sense of urgency rather than menace, convinced me to trust its guidance. The new passage was steeper, requiring an almost vertical climb in places, but I could definitely feel a current of fresh air flowing downward. Behind us, the sounds of confusion grew louder, calls echoing through the tunnels, the pounding of heavy feet on stone. The smoke must have reached the council chamber. As we climbed higher, the passage grew lighter, not from bioluminescence, but from actual moonlight filtering down through cracks in the ceiling. My guide increased our pace, occasionally reaching back to help pull me up particularly difficult sections. Finally, we emerged onto a small ledge high on the mountainside, a concealed entrance camouflaged by scrub brush and boulders. The night air felt impossibly sweet after the stale atmosphere of the caves. Above, stars crowded the Arizona sky, with a waning moon providing just enough light to see by. My unexpected ally stepped out behind me, its features more visible in the moonlight. I could now see it was younger than the others I'd encountered, perhaps an adolescent of its kind. Around its neck hung what I recognized as Martinez's dog tags. "You know Martinez," I said, pointing to the tags. "You've been helping him." The being touched the tags, then placed a hand on its chest, making a sound that might have been its name. It pointed to the transmitter in my pocket, then upward toward the sky, making a questioning noise. "Yes," I confirmed. "Help is coming." I pointed back toward the cave entrance. "Martinez. We need to help Martinez." The creature shook its head vehemently, gesturing down the mountainside, clearly indicating I should leave. Then it pointed to itself, and back to the cave, pantomiming that it would return for Martinez. A distant thrumming reached my ears, helicopter rotors. The emergency signal had been received, and a response was already en route. The being heard it too, its head tilting to track the sound. Without further hesitation, it pressed something into my hand, a small carved object that resembled a stylized human figure with elongated limbs, then disappeared back into the cave entrance. I scrambled down to a clearing where the helicopter could spot me, waving my arms as its searchlight swept the mountainside. As the aircraft descended, I clutched the carved figure, knowing it represented more than a simple artifact. It was evidence of an incredible truth, that legends sometimes walked in flesh and blood, and that the line between myth and reality was far thinner than modern humanity believed. The helicopter touched down, and military personnel rushed out, weapons ready. I identified myself, showing my ID and explaining I had found Martinez alive in the cave system. When they asked what I'd discovered about the surveillance operation, I hesitated. What would happen if I told them the truth? Would they cordon off the mountain, send in teams to capture or kill the Tsinane, study them, dissect them, destroy? What would happen if I told them the truth? Would they cordon off the mountain, send in teams to capture or kill the Tsinane, study them, dissect them, destroy what remained of an ancient people already on the brink of extinction? I thought of my grandfather's teachings about respect for the land and its original inhabitants, of the young being who had helped me escape, who wore Martinez's dog tags, of the elder's visions showing centuries of retreat before the human advance. "Sergeant Johnson, report!" the commanding officer shouted over the helicopter's noise. I made my decision in that moment. "Foreign surveillance equipment confirmed, sir," I called back. "But it was abandoned. Looks like they were monitoring our training operations at Fort Huachuca, then pulled out in a hurry. Martinez has been surviving on his own since his accident. He's injured but alive in the cave system. We need extraction teams with climbing gear." The officer nodded, already radioing for additional support. As I was led to the helicopter, I slipped the carved figure deep into my pocket. Some secrets belong to the mountains. Some truths were not meant for military reports. 3 days later, I sat beside Martinez's hospital bed at Fort Huachuca's medical facility. His physical condition was improving, though the doctors remained concerned about his psychological state. He hadn't spoken since the rescue, responding to questions with only nods or blank stares. We were alone in the room when he finally broke his silence. "You didn't tell them," he said, his voice rough from disuse. I shook my head. "Some things should remain mysteries." Martinez nodded slowly. "They would never understand. They'd hunt them down, turn them into lab specimens." He turned to face me directly. "Did my friend find you? The young one?" "Yes," I confirmed, showing him the carved figure. "It gave me this." Martinez's eyes widened in recognition. "A kinship token. It means you're under their protection now." He touched his temple. "They'll know you wherever you go in their territory." "Will they survive?" I asked. "Perhaps. They've endured this long." Martinez looked out the window toward the distant mountains. "The young ones, some of them want contact, understanding. The elders fear it would lead to their final destruction." "And what do you think?" "I think secrets have power," he replied. "As long as people believe but don't know for certain, that's the boundary where they can exist." His words echoed my grandfather's teachings, that some mysteries should remain just that. The official report on the incident cited evidence of abandoned surveillance equipment, possibly left by foreign operatives monitoring military activities. Martinez's disappearance was reclassified from desertion to injury during reconnaissance. My supporting statement was accepted without question, a decorated sergeant's word rarely doubted. I was granted leave after the mission debrief. The first thing I did was drive to my grandfather's old homestead on the reservation. The cabin was weathered but still standing, much like the old man had been before cancer took him 3 years prior. Inside, I found his journal, filled with handwritten accounts of encounters with the Shadow People, his term for what Martinez called the Tsinane. My grandfather had known, had perhaps even communicated with them, as I now suspected generations of Apache had done. I added my own account to the final pages of his journal, then sealed it in a waterproof container and buried it beneath the floorboards. Future generations might need this knowledge, but for now, it would remain hidden. That night, as I slept in my grandfather's cabin, I dreamed of underground passages and bioluminescent light, of ancient eyes watching from forest shadows, of boundaries between worlds growing thin in certain places at certain times. In my dream, the young Tsinane stood at the tree line, Martinez's dog tag still around its neck. It raised one long-fingered hand in what might have been greeting or warning, then melted back into the darkness between the pines. I awoke at dawn, the carved figure clutched in my hand, warm as if alive. Through the cabin window, I could see fresh tracks in the soil of my grandfather's garden, wide, splayed impressions that resembled neither bear nor human, yet somehow suggested elements of both. Some would call it evidence. I chose to see it as a reminder. The wilderness holds secrets older than human memory. Some legends walk on 2 legs. And sometimes the monsters in our stories are simply people we haven't learned to understand. I am Tarek White Eagle Johnson. I carry Apache blood and Army dog tags. And I guard the boundary between 2 worlds, knowing that some shadows in the pines are watching, waiting, remembering, I was so sure it would be the perfect day for a winter hunt. The kind of morning that promises something special. January 27th, 2022, marked in my calendar weeks in advance. The forecast had predicted ideal conditions: light snowfall overnight with clear skies by dawn, perfect tracking conditions, perfect visibility. The car ride to Harrisville State Park felt oddly quiet, except for the heater rattling against the cold and my German Shepherd Jax panting in the back seat. Every few miles, I glanced over my shoulder to make sure he was as fired up as I was. He always seemed to know when we were headed somewhere with open space and fresh air. "Today's the day, buddy," I said, reaching back to scratch behind his ears. His tail thumped against the seat in response. "We'll bring home something good." I'd been coming to these woods since I was a kid, tagging along with my uncle. Back then, I was just the pack mule, carrying equipment and listening to hunting stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Now at 33, I had stories of my own, none quite as impressive as Uncle Roy's, but I was working on it. My truck's tires crunched through the fresh snow as I pulled into the nearly empty parking area. Only one other vehicle occupied the lot, an old blue pickup parked near the trailhead sign. Early bird, I thought, hoping they'd headed in a different direction. I preferred solitude on hunting days. Stepping onto the snow at the trailhead, I noticed how it sparkled under a low gray sky. A deep hush hung over everything. No birds calling, no rustling of leaves, just the crunch under my boots. The crisp bite in the air made me shiver, but I was too eager to let it bother me. Jax tugged at the flimsy, retractable leash, sniffing and pawing at the ground, as if he already had a lead on something. I tried not to think about how cheaply made that leash felt in my hand. I should have invested in a proper lead, the kind designed for working dogs, not the discount store variety I'd grabbed on impulse. The plastic handle was already showing stress marks from previous outings, but I'd convinced myself it would hold for one more trip. "Easy, Jax," I murmured, adjusting my rifle strap across my shoulder. The weight of it felt reassuring, a connection to generations of hunters before me. I checked my pocket for extra ammunition and made sure my hunting knife was secure on my belt. The forest opened before us like a scene from a winter postcard. Fresh powder blanketed the ground, unmarred except for the occasional rabbit track or deer trail. Barren tree branches stretched toward the sky, their dark silhouettes stark against the snow. In the summer, these woods teemed with hikers and families. In winter, they became a different world altogether, silent, primal, and sometimes unforgiving. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the clean, sharp air. This was what I needed after months of being cooped up in my small accounting office, staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred. Out here, surrounded by wilderness, I felt more like myself. Everything seemed serene at first, but I remember spotting strange canine tracks in the snow. They looked a bit larger than the usual fox prints I'd seen around these parts. My pulse quickened, and I could sense Jax honing in on the scent. In that moment, I convinced myself it was just a stray dog, or maybe a coyote passing through. Michigan winters can turn even familiar animals into elusive shadows. As we ventured deeper along the trail, the forest grew denser. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in weak, diluted beams that barely warmed the skin. I checked my watch. 9:17 a.m. We had plenty of daylight ahead of us, though in winter, the sun always seemed to race toward the horizon faster than expected. Jax's energy rose, and a little voice in the back of my mind warned me to keep calm. Instead, I started talking him up, telling him to find whatever's out there. It was an idiotic move. He was already excited, and my words only fueled his enthusiasm. Before I knew it, the plastic handle of that bargain leash started to bend. I gripped it tighter, but Jax gave one mighty pull, and the cord snapped. In the blink of an eye, he darted off between the trees, paws kicking up clouds of powder. "Jax!" I shouted, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the snow-laden air. "Jax, come!" The only response was the fading sound of his excited barking as he disappeared into the underbrush. I stood frozen, watching the spot where he'd vanished, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. I reached for my phone, thinking I should mark my location before going after him. The screen showed no service, not unusual for these parts. I tucked it away, cursing under my breath. I'd trained Jax to return to my whistle, but in his current state of excitement, I doubted he'd hear it, let alone obey. The beginnings of real worry crept into my mind. Jax was a domesticated animal, not a wild hunter. If he encountered something dangerous, a coyote, a bear, or even a territorial buck, he wouldn't know how to handle himself. The thought of him injured somewhere in these vast woods made my stomach lurch. I shouldered my rifle more securely and started after him, following his tracks in the fresh snow. I'd come to hunt, but suddenly the day had transformed into something altogether different, a desperate search for my companion. My hands shook as I shouted for him, but my voice seemed to vanish in the stillness. For a second, I felt rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the sight of my dog disappearing into a wild expanse. Then my body lurched forward and I tore after him, trudging through snow that seemed to get deeper with every step. I could see his tracks, spaced far apart from his bounding stride. The forest around me felt larger and colder now that I was alone. My breathing started to get rough, a mix of worry and the frantic pace I was forcing on myself. If Jax found an actual coyote or something worse, he might get hurt. And if I couldn't keep up with him, he could be gone for good. The deeper I went, the more anxious I became. It felt like each tree watched me rush by, not a single branch shifting. The hush had turned ominous, and I kept expecting something to bolt out of the shadows. I tried calling Jax again, voice cracking. The wind picked up, whistling through the bare branches overhead. It carried flecks of snow that stung my exposed cheeks and forehead. I pulled my hat lower, wishing I'd worn a face mask. My breath clouded before me in rapid puffs as I pushed forward, following Jax's increasingly scattered tracks. In the distance, I heard him barking, but the echo played tricks on my ears, making it impossible to pinpoint his direction. I pressed on, ignoring the tremor in my legs. The ground was slick in places, hidden ice patches waiting for a misstep. Panic started to creep into my thoughts. If I lost the trail, there was no guarantee I'd find it again. Jax was a big dog, but the woods are bigger. My mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. What if he fell through ice on the creek? What if he encountered a pack of coyotes? What if he simply ran too far and couldn't find his way back? The isolation of the forest suddenly felt oppressive rather than liberating. I checked my watch again, 10:03 a.m. Less than an hour since we'd started, but it felt like an eternity. I'd covered nearly a mile following Jax's trail, moving deeper into a section of the park I wasn't familiar with. The trees here grew closer together, their branches forming a dense network overhead that blocked most of the already weak sunlight. So I pushed forward, adrenaline urging me to keep going no matter how numb my fingers felt or how stiff my joints had become from the cold. There was only one goal at that moment: find Jax, latch onto him somehow, and get the both of us out of this place. Little did I know, the real danger hadn't even begun. The terrain began to change, sloping gradually downward. I knew the creek ran through this part of the forest, a narrow, rocky waterway that would be partially frozen this time of year. In summer, it was little more than a pleasant babble over smooth stones. In winter, it transformed into a treacherous ribbon of ice and frigid water. I slowed my pace, trying to regain control of my breathing. The exertion had me sweating beneath my layers, a dangerous condition in cold weather. If I pushed too hard and soaked my clothes with perspiration, hypothermia would become a real threat when I eventually stopped moving. Jax's barking grew louder, more insistent. He had found something. I quickened my pace again, recklessness overtaking caution. I caught a glimpse of Jax darting onto a narrow, half-forgotten trail that ran along the creek. Even though I'd been here in the summer, everything looked completely foreign under so much snow. My boots hit patches of ice more than solid ground, and the edges of the path were dangerously slick. But I barely thought twice. I needed to catch up before he vanished for good. The slope ahead was brutal. I tried to walk carefully, but Jax was already bounding up ahead, his tracks spaced too far apart for me to match in a normal stride. I hurried, and my foot slid on a hidden patch of ice. 1 minute I was upright, the next I was hitting the ground so hard it jarred my teeth. My lungs seized up. My vision blurred around the edges. Instinct made me twist, trying to dig my hands into the snow, but I was on a downhill slide. Every rock and jutting root bruised me on the way down. I reached out for anything to stop the momentum. My fingers brushed something, a branch maybe, but it snapped instantly. The world spun around me, a kaleidoscope of white snow, gray sky, and dark tree trunks. I lost all sense of direction as I tumbled, my rifle tearing free from my shoulder strap and clattering somewhere nearby. Pain exploded in my side as I collided with what felt like a boulder. I gasped, trying to catch my breath, but the momentum carried me further. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. In reality, the fall probably lasted only seconds, but each impact, each revolution felt like its own distinct moment of terror. I couldn't tell which way was up. All I knew was the sickening sensation of having no control over my body's movement. The hillside rushed by in a blur of white and brown. Then I slammed onto the creek, breaking through a layer of ice that gave way under my weight. The water almost took my breath away. It was a cold so intense my muscles clenched. The shock shot through my limbs, making it hard to think straight. Struggling onto all fours, I felt the stream creeping up my elbows. My jacket and pants soaked it up like a sponge. The creek wasn't deep, perhaps 2 feet at its center, but the temperature was brutal. January in northern Michigan meant water temperatures just above freezing. The human body can withstand such cold for only minutes before hypothermia sets in. One wrong move, and I'd submerge my entire body in that freezing mess. With a desperate push, I managed to get my torso onto thicker ice near the bank, then crawled until I was clear of the water. That's when the pain in my leg flared up. My pant leg was torn and blood was staining the snow. I tried to stand, wincing as my knee threatened to buckle. There was a sharp, pulsing throb like a warning light in my brain. I looked up the slope I'd just descended. It wasn't particularly steep, but the combination of ice and snow had made it treacherous. My rifle lay about halfway up, partially buried in snow. I'd need to retrieve it, but first I had to assess the damage to my leg. I remember thinking that I'd be in deep trouble if an animal picked up the scent of fresh blood. With my luck, there might be a hungry coyote lurking in the distance, watching for an easy meal. I peeled back the torn fabric of my pants to reveal a jagged gash on my right knee, about 3 inches long. It wasn't dangerously deep, but it was bleeding steadily. I scooped up a handful of clean snow and pressed it against the wound, gritting my teeth against the sting. The cold would help constrict the blood vessels at least. Looking around, I realized I'd lost my bearings completely. The creek stretched in both directions, curving out of sight among the trees. The sun was hidden behind uniform gray clouds, offering no directional guidance. My phone was still in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen remained dark. The impact or the water had killed it. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was injured, soaking wet in freezing temperatures with no communication and no clear path back to civilization. And my dog was still missing. Jack showed up, completely unfazed, panting like he'd just had the time of his life. Relief washed over me, but anger flickered too. I couldn't handle him bolting again, so I grabbed the broken cord from his side and tied it around my wrist. "Where the hell have you been?" I rasped, my voice shaking with cold and relief. He just wagged his tail, oblivious to my predicament. In his mind, this was all part of a grand adventure. For me, it was rapidly becoming a nightmare. My fingers shook from the cold, and it felt like the wind was trying to slice through every layer of clothing I had on. I knew I needed to move, to get circulation flowing through my extremities. Hypothermia was the immediate threat. Wet clothes in winter conditions could kill faster than almost anything else in these woods. I looked at my watch again, surprised to find it still working, 10:37 a.m. The fall and its aftermath had consumed barely half an hour, though it felt like hours had passed. I still had daylight, but my situation was precarious. Climbing up the bank became a test of will. The snow soaked into my gloves each time I touched the ground, and I was limping so badly I had to half-drag my leg. I managed to retrieve my rifle, brushing off the snow and checking for damage. The scope seemed intact, a small mercy. I tried to orient myself, searching for landmarks. The park covered nearly 2,000 acres, and I'd wandered well off the marked trails. The creek might lead to a more traveled area, but following it would mean slower going. The alternative was striking out directly through the woods, hoping to intersect a trail. I decided to climb to higher ground first, to get a better view. Each step sent pain shooting through my injured knee, and my wet clothes had begun to freeze in places, becoming stiff and even more uncomfortable. Jack stayed close now, sensing perhaps that something was wrong. When I reached a small clearing at the top of a rise, I paused to catch my breath. The landscape spread out before me, an endless sea of trees, their dark trunks stark against the snow. No sign of trails, roads, or structures, just wilderness stretching in every direction. A new wave of fear washed over me. I was more lost than I'd initially thought. The familiar paths I'd traveled hundreds of times might as well have been in another country. Winter had transformed everything, erasing the markers I relied on during warmer months. It must have been 2 miles or more back to the car, but it felt like crossing some frozen wasteland. The quiet of the woods did nothing to calm me. Every crack of an ice-laden branch overhead made me flinch, and I kept checking behind me, convinced something might step out from the trees. I tried to remember the basics of wilderness survival. Priority 1, find shelter. Priority 2, build a fire. But my matches were soaked, my lighter somewhere in the snow where I'd fallen. Besides, I wasn't stranded in remote wilderness, I was in a state park. There had to be a way out. I decided to head in what I hoped was a northerly direction, where the main trail should be. Each step was agony, but standing still meant certain hypothermia. My wet jeans had begun to freeze, creating a bizarre stiffness that made walking even more difficult. Time seemed to stretch and contract. The gray sky offered no clues about the hour. Only my watch, which I checked compulsively, told me that minutes were indeed passing. Jack stayed by my side, occasionally looking up at me with what seemed like concern. The cord around my wrist was a lifeline now, keeping us together. My thoughts grew increasingly scattered, a bad sign. I knew hypothermia affected cognitive function first. I forced myself to focus, to put one foot in front of the other. Just keep moving. Just keep moving. When I finally spotted the faint outline of the parking lot, my throat tightened. That battered old car looked like the only safe place on earth. I nearly collapsed against it, fumbling for my keys, my wet gloves making it impossible to grip anything. Jax hopped in the back seat on his own, tail wagging, while I cranked the heater and peeled off my soaked jacket. I threw my rifle onto the floor, realizing there was no way I'd be firing any shots in this condition. My hands were numb, and I was still bleeding. The digital clock on the dashboard read 12:23 p.m. Nearly 3 hours had passed since we'd set out. It felt like days. The first aid kit was tucked under the passenger seat, and I tore into it like a lifeline, bandaging my knee with unsteady hands. Warm air finally blasted from the vents, but my teeth kept chattering, and I couldn't stop replaying each second of that descent down the hill. I peeled off my frozen gloves, wincing as circulation returned to my fingers in painful tingles. My hands were pale, with alarming white patches on several fingertips, the early signs of frostbite. I held them directly in front of the heating vent, enduring the burning sensation as they slowly warmed. The bleeding from my knee had slowed, but the wound needed proper cleaning and probably stitches. My entire right side ached from the impacts during the fall. I'd be a mass of bruises tomorrow, assuming I made it to tomorrow. I reached for a bottle of water I'd left in the cup holder, my throat suddenly parched. The liquid was ice cold, but felt like life itself flowing down my throat. I offered some to Jax, who lapped eagerly from my cupped palm. Looking out at the woods through the steaming windshield, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief at my escape, anger at my own carelessness, and a new respect for the power of nature. Those trees that had seemed so peaceful, so inviting just hours ago now looked menacing, as if they'd been waiting to claim me. I needed to get to urgent care. The gash in my knee required professional attention, and I needed to be checked for hypothermia. The nearest medical facility was in Harrisville, about 20 minutes away. I wasn't sure I could drive safely, but I had no choice. Eventually, I drove away, the engine's hum mixing with the rush of thoughts in my head. Jack settled in, eyes half closed. I kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, feeling a jumbled mess of relief, anger, and gratitude. That stretch of creek could have become my grave if I'd hit my head or gone under the ice. The miles slipped by in a haze of slush and salted roads. I kept thinking how close I'd come to not making it out. One broken leash, one moment of distraction, and suddenly nature had me in its teeth, ready to swallow me whole. The urgent care facility was busy with the usual winter casualties: broken wrists from ice falls, children with severe colds, elderly patients with breathing difficulties. I sat in the waiting room, still shivering despite the building's warmth. Jax had to stay in the car, where I'd left the engine running for heat. I checked on him through the window every few minutes, irrationally afraid he might disappear again. When the doctor finally examined me, his expression was grave. "You're lucky," he said, cleaning my wound with antiseptic that stung worse than the initial injury. "Another hour out there in wet clothes and we'd be treating you for severe hypothermia. As it is, you have mild frostbite on your fingers and early hypothermia." He sutured my knee, 7 stitches in total, and wrapped it in clean bandages. "Stay off it for a few days," he advised, "and no more winter hikes alone." I didn't tell him I hadn't been alone. Somehow, explaining about Jax felt like admitting to a deeper failure. that I couldn't even control my own dog, let alone navigate the wilderness safely. The prescription for antibiotics and pain relievers felt like a tangible reminder of my mistake. I paid the bill, grimacing at the cost. Another consequence of my poor judgment. Back in the car, Jax greeted me with his usual enthusiasm. I scratched behind his ears mechanically, my mind still processing the events of the day. I knew I'd need to get my leg checked out. I needed dry clothes and something hot to drink. More than anything, though, I needed to get home, to let the warmth of the house chase away the memory of that frigid water. The drive home was longer than usual, or perhaps it just felt that way. Every bump in the road sent pain shooting through my knee. The heater blasted at maximum, but I still felt a deep chill that seemed to radiate from my bones outward. I passed familiar landmarks, the gas station where I always filled up before hunting trips, the diner where I sometimes stopped for breakfast, the turnoff to my neighborhood. Each sight reinforced that I was returning to safety, to civilization. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched by something in the woods. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I couldn't decide if I felt lucky or just plain foolish. The house looked like a sanctuary, warm lights glowing in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney where I'd left a fire banked that morning. Jax bounded from the car as soon as I opened the door, eager to return to familiar territory. I followed more slowly, each step a reminder of how close I'd come to disaster. Inside, the warmth enveloped me like an embrace. I peeled off my damp clothes, leaving them in a heap by the door. A hot shower washed away the physical remnants of the ordeal, but the memory remained vivid. The sensation of falling, the crack of ice, the mind-numbing cold of the water. Later, wrapped in a blanket on the couch with Jax at my feet, I sipped hot tea and contemplated how quickly things had spiraled out of control. One moment I was a confident hunter in familiar territory, the next I was fighting for survival. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt myself falling again, heard the crack of ice, felt the shocking cold of the creek water. I'd jolt awake, heart racing, to find Jax watching me with concerned eyes from his bed in the corner. The pain in my knee throbbed in time with my heartbeat, a persistent reminder of my brush with disaster. The antibiotics sat on my bedside table along with the painkillers, which I'd been reluctant to take. Somehow I felt I deserved the pain, a necessary reminder of my foolishness. As dawn broke, I limped to the window and looked out at my backyard. The same snow that had nearly claimed me in the forest now looked benign, even beautiful as it glittered in the first rays of sunlight. Nature's dual faces, serene beauty and merciless killer, had never been clearer to me. I'd been hunting these woods since I was a teenager, had always prided myself on my outdoorsmanship. Yet one moment of carelessness had nearly cost me everything. The cheap leash, the excitement egging Jax on, the reckless pursuit, all preventable mistakes. Over coffee, I found myself online ordering a proper hunting harness for Jax, the kind with reinforced stitching and a secure clasp that wouldn't fail under pressure. I added a personal locator beacon to my cart as well, along with waterproof matches and an emergency blanket for my pack. Small investments that could mean the difference between life and death. The doctor had advised staying off my leg, but restlessness drove me to pace the house, Jax following at my heels as if afraid to let me out of his sight. Perhaps he sensed how close we'd come to not making it home at all. I canceled my plans for the coming weekend, another hunting trip I'd been looking forward to for months. It wasn't just the injury keeping me away, it was a newfound respect for the dangers lurking in those familiar woods. I needed time to recover, not just physically, but mentally, to rebuild the confidence that had been shattered along with the ice on that creek. In the following days, friends called to check in. I told them a sanitized version of events, a slip on ice, a minor injury. The full story felt too raw, too personal to share. How could I explain the moment when I realized I might not make it out? The primal fear that had gripped me as I crawled from that freezing water, the desperate trek back, each step a battle against pain and cold. A week later, my knee was healing well, though the doctor warned I might feel twinges in cold weather for years to come, a permanent souvenir of my misadventure. The frostbitten patches on my fingers had peeled, revealing new, tender skin beneath. I limped to my front door, Jax by my side, vowing I'd never let a scrap of cheap plastic determine our fate again. The forest would be waiting when I was ready to return, not as a conquered territory, but as a powerful force deserving of respect and careful preparation. Winter hunts aren't games, and careless decisions can turn a simple outing into a nightmare. Nature doesn't care about experience or confidence. It simply exists, indifferent to human folly. This lesson, etched into my memory and my flesh, would guide every future venture into the wilderness. As I scratched Jax behind the ears, watching snowflakes begin to fall outside my window, I felt a complex mixture of gratitude for our survival and humility in the face of forces far greater than myself. I had entered those woods as a hunter, confident and prepared, or so I thought. I had emerged as something else, a student perhaps, with a newfound appreciation for the thin line between adventure and disaster.